when my father's debt became my prison, and his love became my war. She had 48 hours to save her family before the men with guns came back. And when the most dangerous man in the city offered her a way out, the price wasn't money. It was her freedom, her name, and every wall she'd ever built around her heart. What happens when the monster who owns you turns out to be the only person willing to die for you? Stay until the very last second of this story, because nothing, and I mean nothing, is what it appears to be. If this story finds you tonight, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Maris Ellington knew before she answered it that her life was about to split in two. She was standing in the vineyard behind her childhood home, wearing mud-caked boots and her dead mother's cardigan, checking irrigation lines by flashlight the way she'd done every night that week because the irrigation controller had shorted out and they couldn't afford to replace it. The vines were old, some of them planted 40 years ago by her grandfather's hands, and in the beam of the flashlight, they looked like twisted black arms reaching out of the earth. She'd always found them beautiful. That night, they just looked desperate. Her phone buzzed against her hip. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. "Miss Ellington?" The voice on the other end was male, calm, and completely without effect. The way you'd sound if you'd long ago stopped caring whether the person on the other end was frightened. "My employer would like to discuss your father's account. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. The Meridian Building downtown, 42nd floor." A pause. "He strongly encourages you not to be late." The line went dead before she could ask a single question. She stood there in the dark for a long time after that, listening to the wind move through the vines and her own breathing and nothing else. Because the nearest house was 2 miles away, and her father had gone on a business trip to Zurich 11 days ago and stopped returning calls 6 days ago. And she was alone on 40 acres of land that the bank had already started the paperwork to take back, and she had just been politely summoned by someone who used words like employer and account, the way normal people used words like bill and overdue notice. She went inside and didn't sleep. Maris had grown up understanding that her father, Thomas Ellington, was a man of tremendous optimism and flexible ethics. He was the kind of man who shook hands with everyone in a room and remembered their children's names and always picked up the check. And he had run Ellington Estate Wines for 22 years on the back of that personality and a product that was genuinely, undeniably good. The wines won awards. The vineyard attracted visitors from 4 states. For a while, when Maris was a teenager, they had been comfortable in the quiet, rural way that meant never worrying about groceries but always worrying about weather and harvest yields. Then her mother died when Maris was 19, and something in Thomas Ellington quietly came unmoored. He made a series of investments over the following 5 years that Maris only understood in retrospect. A restaurant group that went bankrupt, a distillery partnership that dissolved in litigation, a Napa Valley acquisition that fell apart when the seller was indicted for fraud. Each failure led to a new loan, and each new loan led to another gamble. And by the time Maris graduated with her agricultural management degree and came home to run the vineyard's operations, the books were a disaster she spent 2 years trying to untangle. She never found the bottom of it. She now understood why. She left the house at 7:30 the next morning, drove 90 minutes to the city in her truck with the cracked dashboard and the passenger window that wouldn't roll all the way up, parked in a public garage 3 blocks from the Meridian Building, and walked the rest of the way in the best blazer she owned, which was dark green and slightly too formal for anything other than funerals or court appearances. The Meridian Building was glass and steel, and so clean it looked like it had never once been touched by weather. The lobby had marble floors and a security desk staffed by 2 men who checked her name against a list with the kind of quiet efficiency that told her they did this constantly and thought nothing of it. 42nd floor. The elevator opened into a reception area that didn't look like any office she'd ever seen. No corporate logos, no motivational posters, just dark wood, low lighting, a single desk staffed by a woman in her 30s who looked like she could dismantle something efficiently and without drama, and behind her, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the entire city laid out like a circuit board. "Miss Ellington." The woman gestured toward a set of double doors. "He's expecting you." Maris had prepared herself for many things on the drive in: a lawyer, a collection agency representative, someone clinical and distant who would hand her documents and explain numbers and give her a timeline. She had not prepared herself for Damien Viscari. He was standing at the window when she walked in, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the city with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that stillness was a form of power. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have always had expensive things. His hair was dark, cut close at the sides. He was younger than she'd imagined, 40 maybe, with a face that was angular and controlled and gave away absolutely nothing. He turned when she entered, and his eyes, dark gray, the color of overcast sky, moved over her once in a way that wasn't appreciative or threatening, but was somehow more unsettling than either. It was the look of someone assessing a variable. "Sit down, Miss Ellington." It wasn't rude, it wasn't warm, it was simply stated the way someone states a fact that doesn't require agreement. She sat. He remained standing, which she understood immediately was deliberate, and crossed to the desk but didn't sit behind it. Instead, he stood at the edge of it, close enough that she had to look up slightly, and set a folder on the surface in front of her. "Open it." She did. The first page was a loan agreement. The signature at the bottom was her father's. She'd know it anywhere, the extravagant looping T, the way he always underlined his name twice like a man emphasizing a point. The amount on the document made her vision go briefly white at the edges. $14,200,000. "The second page," Damien said. Second loan, same signature, different institution, or what had appeared to be a different institution, 8.6 million. Third page. She turned it. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that, even though her pulse was doing something irregular and her mouth had gone completely dry. 4.9 million. A line of credit against the vineyard property itself. She closed the folder. "That's over $27 million, she said, and was surprised by how level her voice came out. $27,840,000, Damien said. With accrued interest over the past 18 months, $31.2 million. She looked up at him. "My father borrowed $31 million from you. From entities I control, yes. And you're here because he's gone." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just a slight tightening around the eyes that might have been impatience or might have been something else entirely. "I'm here because I prefer to resolve these matters directly." Maris set the folder back on the desk and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed slowly and thought about the vineyard. The 40-year-old vines, her grandfather's hands pressing seeds into dirt, her mother in a wide-brimmed hat checking the sugar content of grapes in August sunlight. "I don't have $31 million, she said. "You know I don't have $31 million. The vineyard is worth maybe $4 million in this market, and the bank already has a senior lien on it. So what is it you actually want?" Damien Viscari looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that felt like calculation, like he was running numbers, like he was deciding something he'd already decided and was simply confirming it. Then he said, "Marry me." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, which felt much longer. "Excuse me," Maris said. "A contract marriage, 1 year." He moved around the desk and sat down then, finally, as if the offer itself had settled something. He opened a different folder, his own, and slid a document across to her. "At the end of 12 months, every debt your father accumulated will be formally discharged. The vineyard deed will be transferred back to your family, free and clear. You'll receive a monthly living stipend during the term of the contract." He paused. "In exchange, you'll reside at my primary residence, appear at required social functions as my wife, and adhere to the terms outlined in Section 3. Maris didn't look at the document. She looked at him. "You're serious?" "I don't make proposals for entertainment." "Why?" The word came out flat and unadorned because she was past the point of social lubrication. "You're Damien Viscari. I've read about you. You don't need a wife. This is not a normal debt collection strategy." "No," he said. "It isn't." "Then why?" He looked at her with those gray eyes and said nothing for a moment that stretched uncomfortably. Then, "The reasons are mine. The offer is genuine. You have until Friday to decide. And if I say no? He didn't look away. Then I pursue the debt through other available channels. She understood what that meant. Not a legal threat. There was nothing legal about any of this. Other channels meant the vineyard gone wrong, in the kind of way that left people afraid to buy it afterward. It meant whatever her father had bought himself with this money coming due in ways that didn't involve signatures and folders and men in expensive suits. She stood up. I'll need the full contract, she said. Not a summary, every clause. He nodded once. My assistant will send it to you this afternoon. Maris picked up her bag and walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame, because there was one more thing that had been sitting in the back of her throat since she'd opened the folder. My father, she said, without turning around. Do you know where he is? The pause before he answered was just slightly too long. No, said Damien Viscari. She walked out without looking back. She read the contract 4 times on the drive back to the vineyard, pulled over at a rest stop with the document spread across her steering wheel and a gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder. She'd downloaded it to her phone the moment it arrived. 17 pages, dense with legal language that she parsed slowly and carefully because she'd spent enough time with bank documents and agricultural contracts to understand the architecture of formal agreements. Most of it was what he'd described: residency requirements, social appearances, a non-disclosure clause that was predictably comprehensive, the stipend, $32,000 monthly, which made her breath catch because that was more than the vineyard had cleared in its best recent year. Dissolution terms at the end of 12 months. Section 3, the one he'd specifically mentioned, was about conduct. No attempts to access restricted areas of the residence. No contact with specified individuals, a list she didn't recognize yet. No disclosure of household information to outside parties. No interference in business matters. And then, near the bottom of Section 3, a single line that she read 3 times because it seemed so incongruous with the rest of the document's cold transactional precision. The party of the second part shall be accorded full personal autonomy within the primary residence and shall not be subject to demands regarding her personal space, time, or person beyond those requirements specified herein. She sat with that for a long time. Then she drove home, fed the vineyard's aging border collie, ate half a sandwich standing at the kitchen counter, called her father's phone for the 12th time, and got voicemail for the 12th time, and made her decision before she went to sleep. She called the number on the contract cover page the next morning at 8 sharp. I'll sign, she said when the assistant answered, but I want one addition, non-negotiable. A pause. Then, I'll need to relay that to Mr. Viscari. Tell him I want a clause guaranteeing that any information I provide about my father's whereabouts, if I happen to locate him, cannot be used in any punitive action against him without my written consent. If he agrees, we have a deal. She was put on hold for 6 minutes. When the assistant came back, Mr. Viscari agrees to the addendum. We'll have the amended contract to you by noon. She signed it that afternoon. The ink dried fast in the dry autumn air. The wedding was 10 days later. It happened at a civil registry office on a Thursday morning with 2 witnesses she'd never met and would never see again, and it lasted approximately 11 minutes from the moment she stepped inside to the moment she stepped back out, wearing a ring she hadn't chosen and a last name that felt like a costume. Her dress was simple, ivory, tea-length, something she'd found at a consignment shop in town, because the contract didn't specify anything about the ceremony, and she'd be damned if she was going to let Damien Viscari's people dress her. She wore her mother's small pearl earrings. She carried no flowers. Damien arrived exactly on time, which she was already beginning to understand was simply how he operated. He wore a dark suit, no tie, and when he looked at her across the small waiting room, it was with the same assessing calm he'd had in his office, like he was noting variables, confirming data. He didn't say she looked nice. She didn't expect him to. The official read the required words. They repeated the required phrases. Damien slid the ring onto her finger with a kind of clinical precision that should have felt humiliating, but mostly just felt like what it was, a transaction being finalized. When it was done and they walked outside into the thin October sunlight, he turned to her on the steps and said, "The car will take us to the residence. Your belongings have already been transferred." She stopped. You moved my things without asking me? With your permission. You signed the authorization in Section 5. She had. She remembered it now. A general authorization for logistics management. She filed away the lesson. Read more carefully. My dog, she said. A brief pause. He's been settled into the grounds. There's a kennel area, but he's been given access to the East Gardens. She looked at him. He had anticipated the question. She didn't know what to do with that. The car, black, armored in ways she'd only recognize later, pulled up to the curb. He held the door open. Not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of reflex courtesy that told her the gesture was genuine rather than performed. She got in. The drive to the residence took 40 minutes, moving through the city and then into a district she'd only vaguely known existed. An older, quieter part of the metro area, where the streets were wider and lined with the kind of mature trees that took generations to grow. The house, when it appeared behind its iron gate and its stone wall, was not what she'd imagined when she'd heard the word mansion. It was large, very large, but it had the bone structure of something old and genuinely built rather than ostentatiously constructed. Stone facade, multiple wings, grounds that ran in every direction behind the walls. There were people on the property. She counted 4 in the first sweep of her eyes, all positioned in ways that were clearly not decorative. The foyer was high-ceilinged and spare and better lit than she'd expected, with art on the walls that she found herself actually wanting to look at rather than merely acknowledging. Damien led her through it without ceremony, up a staircase, down a corridor, and stopped before a door that he opened and stepped back from. Your rooms, he said. Plural. She walked in. It was a suite, sitting room, bedroom, bathroom, a small study with bookshelves already partially stocked, and a desk positioned to catch afternoon light. Her clothes were in the wardrobe. Her books were on the shelves. Her photographs, the ones of her mother, of the vineyard at harvest, were arranged on the dresser with a care that made something twist uncomfortably in her chest, because it looked like someone had actually looked at them rather than just placing them randomly. She turned to find Damien standing in the doorway. Your access card is on the desk, he said. It allows you through the main house, the gardens, the east wing. If you need anything outside those areas, you ask. He looked at her directly. Don't go into the west wing without me present. Don't access the office suite on the ground floor. Those aren't threats. They're operational requirements. Is that Section 3? She asked. Largely. He looked like he was about to leave, and then he didn't, and in the space of that hesitation, he said something she hadn't anticipated. You're free inside these walls, Miss Ellington, as long as you don't betray me. She held his gaze. That's a significant qualification. Yes, he said. It is. He left. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her bed, for the next year, in a house that belonged to a man she'd met twice, and she pressed her hands between her knees and breathed through the tightness in her chest, and she told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself since she signed the contract. This is survivable. You are not your father. You do not break under pressure. You survive. Then she got up and went to find her dog, Bud. The first week passed in a kind of provisional quiet. She ate most meals alone, in a kitchen that was operated by a rotating staff of 2 who cooked without being asked and left food available without hovering. She walked the gardens every morning with the border collie, whose name was Tuck, who adjusted to the new grounds with the philosophical adaptability of a dog who had always known that territory was temporary. She worked remotely on vineyard accounts. There was still a business to keep alive, even if she wasn't physically there, and she read, and she mapped the house in her mind the way she'd always done in unfamiliar spaces, noting exits and patterns and the rhythms of who moved where and when. She saw Damien at dinner twice, briefly. He ate quickly when he ate at all, standing at the kitchen counter or in transit between rooms, and both times he acknowledged her with a kind of neutral courtesy that felt less like distance and more like someone maintaining a boundary they'd set for their own reasons. On the 8th day, she found something that cracked the provisional quiet wide open. She'd been walking the east garden at dusk when Tuck pulled toward the garden wall, toward a section she hadn't investigated yet, and she followed him to a gate she hadn't known was there, unlocked, slightly ajar, opening onto a service alley. Through the alley's opposite end, she could see a street, And on that street, 3 cars with their engines running, and men she recognized from the house security moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with perimeter maintenance. She pulled Tuck back and stayed behind the wall and watched through the gate's narrow gap as Damien himself came through the alley from the other direction, without a jacket, moving fast, and spoke to the security men in a voice too low to carry. She caught fragments, the processing building on Hayward Street. Get them out first, then... No, I said first, the girls come out before anyone else touches anything. The cars left. Damien stood alone in the alley for a moment, hands on his hips, looking at the ground. Then he looked up, and his gaze went directly to the gate and directly to her face in the gap. She didn't move. He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come. She stayed by the gate in the cooling dark and turned over what she'd heard, the girls come out before anything else, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not the cold confirmation of the monster she'd been prepared for, but something more uncomfortable and more disorienting. She filed it away. She would need more before she let it mean anything. On the 11th night, someone put a photograph under her door. She found it when she went to bed. A manila envelope, no markings, slipped beneath the gap. Inside was a single photograph printed on standard paper. Security camera footage, grainy and date-stamped, showing what appeared to be a parking structure. 2 men. One of them was Damien, unmistakably, in a long dark coat. The other was on the ground, hands zip-tied, face turned toward the camera. Her father's face. The timestamp read 8 months ago, 4 months before the contract. 4 months before Maris had known any of this existed, written on the back of the photograph in a careful, anonymous hand. He didn't disappear. He was taken. Ask your husband where. Maris sat on the edge of her bed and held the photograph with both hands and felt the floor of everything she'd been tentatively building. The careful neutrality, the provisional survival plan, the willingness to endure 1 year, cracked straight through. She looked at her father's face in the photograph. His expression was afraid. Her hands were not steady anymore. Outside her window, the grounds were dark and quiet, and the iron gate stood solid against whatever lay beyond it, and she was inside it, and she had signed a contract binding her here. And the man who had offered her that contract had, if this photograph meant what it appeared to mean, been responsible for her father's disappearance all along. She set the photograph face down on the nightstand. She did not sleep. By morning, she had made a new decision. Not to run, not yet, because running without information was how people got caught, but to find out exactly what Damien Viscari had done with her father, and exactly why, before she decided what to do next. She didn't know yet that finding out the truth would cost her more than she was prepared to pay. She didn't know yet that the photograph was a lie. She didn't know yet that the person who had slipped it under her door was already planning to kill her. She didn't confront him at breakfast. That would have been the emotional response. And Maris Ellington had learned early, from watching her father's optimism detonate against hard reality over and over, that emotion without leverage was just noise. So she folded the photograph back into the manila envelope, slid it between the pages of a book on her nightstand, and went downstairs at 7:30, like every other morning, poured herself coffee from the carafe the kitchen staff left ready, and sat at the long dining table alone with her laptop and her vineyard accounts, and the specific, focused calm of someone who had decided to be patient until patience became a weapon. She needed more than one photograph. Anyone could print a photograph. What she needed was to understand the house. She'd been mapping it passively for 11 days, noting which staff moved where, which security rotations overlapped, where the cameras were positioned in the corridors she was permitted to use. Now she did it actively, with the deliberate attention she'd once applied to tracing irrigation failures across 40 acres of uneven ground. The problem was always the same. Find where the system was hiding its damage before the damage became irreversible. The West Wing was locked to her. The ground floor office suite was off limits. But there were other spaces. A library that connected to a secondary hallway, a sitting room adjacent to what appeared to be a conference space, a basement access she'd noticed behind the kitchen that the staff used and that her access card had never been tested against. She was in the library on the morning of the 12th day, ostensibly looking for something to read, when she heard voices through the wall. She stayed completely still. The library shared a partition with a room she'd cataloged as unused, but the voices were clear enough to carry, low and deliberate, and not intended for her ears. Two men. One she didn't recognize. The other, the cadence, the measured control of it, was Damien. "The Ferretti family wants a decision by the end of the month," the unfamiliar voice said. "Lucien has already approached them." A pause. "Lucien approaches everyone," Damien said. "It's what he does. He's been approaching people for 6 years. This is different. He's offering them the Eastern distribution routes. That's not posturing. That's a concrete offer, and it's one he can only make if he has something he doesn't currently have." Damien's voice was flat. "Yes, I know what it implies." "Then you know you need to move faster than you're moving." Another pause, longer. Maris didn't breathe. "The situation with the girl is more complex than I anticipated," Damien said. "The girl, her. She's a liability," the other voice said. "Not unkindly, just matter-of-factly, the way you describe a weather system moving in a bad direction." "She's a variable," Damien said. "Not the same thing." "Damien, I said not the same thing." The conversation moved. They were walking, the voices shifting away from the partition, and she lost the thread of it. She stood there with her hand resting on the spine of a book she hadn't chosen and felt the specific cold that comes not from temperature, but from understanding that you are being discussed in a room you cannot enter by people who have already decided what category you belong in. Variable. Not a person. Not a wife. Not even a hostage. A variable. She pulled the book off the shelf, sat down in the library's window seat, and opened it to a random page. And when Damien passed the library door 10 minutes later and glanced in, she could feel the glance, had calibrated herself to his movements without quite deciding to. She was reading it with apparent absorption. He didn't stop. She turned a page she hadn't actually read. The name Lucien Vescari appeared for the second time the following evening, at dinner. It was the first dinner she and Damien had actually sat through together, not by design. She'd come down later than usual and found him already at the table, and leaving would have been too deliberate to be natural. So she sat, and the staff served the first course, and they ate in the quiet that had become their default register. Then Damien said, without preamble, "My uncle will be visiting Thursday. There will be a small dinner. I need you present." She looked up from her plate. "What kind of present?" "Seated next to me? Conversational, wifely, in the public-facing sense." He said it without irony. "Lucien is attentive to details. He'll notice an absence." "Attentive how?" Damien looked at her steadily. "The kind of attentive that should make you careful what you say and more careful what you react to." It was the most direct warning he'd given her about anything, and it landed accordingly. She held his gaze. "Is he dangerous?" "Most people at this table will be dangerous, Miss Ellington." "Maris." The correction came out before she thought about it. "If I'm supposed to be your wife, at least use my name." Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement, not warmth, but a small recalibration, like he was updating something. "Maris," he said. "Yes. He's dangerous." "To you or to me?" "Currently, both." She thought about the conversation through the library wall. Lucien has already approached them. "Is this about the Ferretti family?" The stillness that crossed his face was total and immediate. 2 seconds, maybe 3, of complete absence of expression. "Where did you hear that name, Zat?" he said. She hadn't planned to use it. It had slipped out because she was tired, and because the photograph was still between the pages of her book upstairs, and because she was running out of patience for a situation she didn't fully understand. She made a quick decision. "I hear things," she said. "I'm not stupid and I'm not blind, and I've been in this house for nearly 2 weeks. If you want me to perform at a dinner table without knowing what I'm performing in the middle of, that's your choice, but I'll do it badly." He looked at her for a long time, the kind of look that was doing something she couldn't fully read. Not hostile, not warm, but genuinely assessing, the way you look at something you've underestimated. "The Ferretti family," he said finally, "is one of 3 organized crime networks currently being offered an alliance with my uncle, who believes I'm distracted enough right now that he can consolidate power before I respond. The dinner Thursday is partly a message to him that I'm not distracted. And I'm part of that message. You're the visible evidence of stability. He picked up his fork again. A man with a new wife is not a man in crisis. She absorbed this. What does Lucien want? What he's always wanted. Control of everything I've built. He said it without particular heat. He's been patient about it. 6 years patient. He won't wait much longer. She wanted to ask about her father. The photograph was a constant pressure at the back of her thoughts, hot and persistent. But she looked at Damien's face, at the controlled surface of it, the disciplined neutrality, and she understood that asking directly, now, without knowing more, would only give him warning. And if the photograph was true, warning was the last thing she wanted to give him. Thursday, she said. I'll be there. Hunt. Thursday came with a cold front that pushed rain in from the northwest and turned the grounds gray and wet. She dressed carefully. A deep burgundy dress that was elegant without being deferential. Her mother's earrings again, because they were the one thing in this house that was entirely hers. And came downstairs at 7 to find 3 black cars already in the drive and voices in the entrance hall. Lucien Vescari was not what she expected. She had constructed him from fragments, the conversation through the wall, Damien's careful language, the tension she could feel in the house's security staff when his name was mentioned. She'd expected something overtly threatening, the cinematic version of a power-hungry man, all cold eyes and deliberate intimidation. Lucien was 61, white-haired, and almost aggressively charming. He had the broad, open face of a man who had cultivated likability over decades and wore it as naturally as breathing. He was laughing when she came down the stairs, one hand on the shoulder of a younger man beside him, and when he saw her, his expression shifted into something that was either genuine warmth or a perfect simulation of it. There she is. He crossed the foyer toward her without waiting for an introduction, both hands extended, and took hers before she could decide whether to offer them. My nephew's extraordinary wife. I've been hearing about you. Have you? Maris said, and smiled the way she smiled at difficult clients at the vineyard, which was full and easy and reached her eyes and communicated absolutely nothing. Only the essentials. That you're formidable. That you managed to make Damien seem almost human. He said it with a grin directed past her at Damien, who had materialized at her side. She felt him before she saw him, some awareness she'd developed without meaning to. And Damien's return expression was even and unreadable. She does manage that, Damien said. Lucien patted her hands before releasing them. His were warm and dry and held on just slightly too long. I'm very glad to finally meet you, he said, and his eyes, pale blue, bright, moving over her face with an interest that was sharper than the warmth, said something else entirely. There were 8 at dinner. Lucien, 2 men she identified as his senior associates, a woman introduced as a business attorney named Petra, and a 4th guest who arrived late and whose entrance did something to the room's atmosphere that Maris noticed immediately. Celine Duval was perhaps 35, with the kind of beauty that arrived pre-weaponized, dark hair, sharp cheekbones, a green dress that cost more than the vineyard's monthly payroll. She kissed Lucien's cheek and then turned to Damien with an expression that Maris would have needed a week to fully decode. Proprietary and wounded and carefully controlled. Damien. Her voice was low and precisely modulated. Celine. Equally low, equally precise. 2 people performing neutrality for an audience. Then Celine turned to Maris, and her smile was beautiful and absolutely empty. You must be the new wife. I must be, Maris said. Something crossed Celine's face. Not the irritation Maris expected, but a flicker of something more complicated, almost like recognition. It was gone before she could examine it. Dinner was a performance, and Maris performed it. She spoke when addressed, deflected personal questions with a blend of warmth and vagueness she'd perfected dealing with wine buyers who wanted intimate details about the family business, and kept her attention divided, half on the table, half on the subterranean current running beneath the conversation like water under ice. Lucien was testing Damien. She could see it clearly once she stopped reacting to the surface charm. Small references to business decisions, to territory disputes, to names dropped casually that caused invisible flinches in the security men stationed at the room's perimeter. He was probing for weakness and doing it brilliantly, because every probe was wrapped in the language of family concern and avuncular care. And Damien answered every probe with the same measured, unrevealing calm he deployed for everything. It was Celine who broke the surface. She was 2 glasses into her wine when she turned to Maris with the particular directness of someone who has decided social lubrication is no longer worth the effort, and said, "How did you two actually meet? The public story is very curated." The table's attention shifted. Maris felt Damien's stillness beside her, not tension, but heightened attention, the stillness of someone monitoring. She looked at Celine and found genuine curiosity under the edge of it, which was somehow more disconcerting than hostility would have been. "Through family business," Maris said easily, "mine and his ended up intersecting. These things happen." "Family business," Celine repeated. "Your family's wine estate." "That's right. Damien doesn't drink wine." "He does now," Maris said, and picked up her own glass, and the table's attention eased off. Under the tablecloth, Damien's hand closed briefly over hers. Not a grip, just a touch. 2 seconds, the pressure of acknowledgement, and was gone before anyone could have noticed it. She didn't look at him. After dinner, when the guests were in the sitting room with after-dinner drinks, Maris slipped out to the adjacent terrace through a side door. The rain had stopped. The ground smelled of wet stone and dead leaves. She stood at the balustrade and breathed and let herself briefly simply feel how exhausted she was. She heard the door behind her. It was Celine. The woman came to stand beside her at the railing, arms folded against the cold, and for a moment they both just looked at the dark grounds. "I'm going to tell you something," Celine said without preamble, "because I think you're smarter than this situation gives you credit for, and because I'm tired." Maris waited. "Lucien didn't come here for dinner," Celine said. "He came to look at you, to assess whether you're a liability to Damien or a liability he can use." She paused. "He's decided on the second one." Maris looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" Celine's jaw tightened. In the dim light from the house, her face was less composed than it had been at the table. She looked, for a moment, like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. "Because the last person Lucien decided he could use ended up dead," she said. "And I am very, very tired of watching that happen." Before Maris could respond, the terrace door opened and one of Lucien's associates leaned out. "Miss Duval, Mr. Vescari is asking for you." Celine straightened, and the composure came back down like a curtain. She looked at Maris one more moment, then she went inside. Maris stood alone at the railing in the cold and turned what she'd heard over and over in her mind. And by the time she went back inside, she had added Celine Duval to the list of things in this house she didn't yet understand. The next morning, she tested the basement door. Her access card worked. She stood in the stairwell for 5 seconds, confirming that there were no additional sensors she'd missed, then went down. It was storage, mostly. Wine racks, equipment cases, archived file boxes arranged on industrial shelving. She moved through it methodically, not sure what she was looking for, until she found the secondary room at the far end with a keypad lock that her card didn't open. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she went back upstairs, and she was at the kitchen counter with her coffee when Marco, the head of household security, a stocky former military man in his mid-40s who had been professionally courteous to her since day one, came in for his own coffee and stopped when he saw her. "Morning," he said. "Marco," she kept her voice easy. "I was in the basement this morning looking for extra storage space. What's in the locked room at the end?" He poured his coffee without hurrying. "Secured archive. You'd need Mr. Vescari's authorization." "What kind of archive?" "The kind that needs authorization." He looked at her over his mug. Not hostile, just drawing a line. "Fair enough," she said, and went back to her laptop. She filed it away. Everything was a data point. No. She found the second piece of the puzzle 4 days later, and it arrived in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was in the East Garden with Tuck, mid-morning, following the path she'd walked every day because routine made her visible, and predictability in this house was its own form of armor, when she noticed the exterior of the groundskeeper's storage shed had been left open. Nothing unusual, but on the ground just inside, half covered by a tarp, was a crate, and stenciled on its side in black industrial paint was a shipping label she could partially read. She didn't go closer. She stood at a natural distance and let Tuck pull toward it and called him back with the easy voice she used when she wasn't reacting, and walked on. But the partial address on the crate's label had included a street name, Hayward Street, the same name she'd caught through the garden wall gate that first night, the processing building on Hayward Street. Whatever Damien had sent his people to do on Hayward Street the night she'd watched through the gate, that operation was connected to this house in ways that moved through the groundskeeper's shed, through a basement room with a keypad lock, through crates moved at hours she hadn't been watching. She needed to know what Damien's operation on Hayward Street had actually been. She needed to know, because if she was going to understand whether the photograph under her door was evidence or manipulation, she needed to understand what kind of man she was actually living with. Not the public story, not the controlled surface, but the actual operational reality of his choices. She got her answer in a way she hadn't expected, 3 nights later, when she couldn't sleep and came downstairs for water at 2 a.m. and found Damien in the kitchen. He was at the counter, still in his day clothes, which meant he hadn't slept either. There was a glass of water in front of him, and he was reading something on his phone with the particular focused exhaustion of someone processing difficult information. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. She got her water. He put his phone down. Hayward Street, she said. She'd decided, in the insomnia of the past 3 nights, that patience as a weapon only worked if you eventually used it. What happened there? He looked at her steadily. That's not your concern. You said I was a variable, not a liability. She set her glass down. Variables need information to be useful. Something moved in his face. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration. Where did you hear me say that? The library shares a wall with the room you were in 11 days ago. She watched his expression. I wasn't eavesdropping deliberately, but I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear it. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, There's a labor trafficking network that's been operating in this city for 9 years. 3 weeks ago, we identified a processing location. He held her gaze. We extracted 11 women and 4 minors before the location was shut down. The kitchen was very quiet. You extracted them, she said carefully. My people did. And then what? They were transferred to a secure shelter network that doesn't connect to my name or my business. He picked up his glass. The men running the location are currently unavailable. She didn't ask what unavailable meant. She didn't need to. Why? She said instead. Why do that? You run. Your business isn't exactly... She stopped, reformulated. It's not the expected priority for someone in your position. He looked at her for a moment that stretched, and then he said something she could tell he hadn't planned to say. My mother spent 8 months in a labor camp when she was 17, before she got out. He said it flatly, without seeking sympathy. It's not complicated. She absorbed this. The kitchen hum was loud in the quiet. Someone put a photograph under my door, she said. 12 days ago. He went very still. Security footage, she continued. Dated 8 months ago. It showed you in a parking structure with a man on the ground, hands bound. The man was my father. The stillness in Damien's face was different now. It wasn't the controlled blankness she'd learned to read as his default. It was something harder and colder, and with an edge of something she would have called alarm if she'd thought he was capable of it. Show me, he said. Why? Because if that photograph exists, he said very quietly, then someone in this house knew about your father before you told me, and I need to know who. She looked at him. He looked back, and she realized, with the slow, unsteady quality of a conviction reforming under pressure, that his reaction wasn't the reaction of a man confronted with evidence of his own actions. It was the reaction of a man who had just discovered a security breach. She went upstairs and got the photograph and brought it down and put it on the counter in front of him. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. "This is doctored," he said finally. "The timestamp format uses a dash separator. Our archive system uses a colon." He looked up at her. "Whoever made this knew enough about our security footage to replicate the frame style, but not the metadata format." "That could be something you're just saying." "Yes," he said. "It could." He met her eyes. "I didn't take your father. I don't know where your father is. And I need you to decide whether you believe that or not, because if someone in this house is running operations I don't know about, we are both in significant danger, and I can't protect you if you're working against me." The word protect landed strangely. She hadn't asked to be protected. She hadn't come here to be protected. She'd come here to buy her family's survival with a year of her life. But she looked at the photograph on the counter, and she looked at his face, and she thought about Celine Duval on the terrace. The last person Lucien decided he could use ended up dead. And she thought about the name on the crate, and the women extracted from Hayward Street, and the single line in Section 3 of the contract, full personal autonomy. "I don't know what I believe yet," she said. "That's honest," he said. "I want access to the basement archive room." The pause was brief. "Why?" "Because whatever is in there is connected to something moving through this property, and I'd rather know what I'm standing in the middle of than find out when it's too late to matter." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and set a secondary key card on the counter beside the photograph. "Tomorrow," he said. "With me." She picked up the key card. She should have waited until morning. She waited until 3 a.m. when the house had reached its deepest quiet, and she used the key card alone. The archive room was larger than she'd expected, a climate-controlled space with floor-to-ceiling filing systems and a central workstation, and at the far wall, a digital display running what appeared to be a live mapping system. Location pins across the city, color-coded, with small data tags she couldn't immediately interpret. She moved to the filing system and opened the first accessible drawer, and found, 3 folders in, a folder labeled with her father's name, Thomas Ellington. Her hands were steady when she opened it, which surprised her because her pulse was doing something seismic. The folder was thick. Surveillance photographs, her father, in locations she recognized and some she didn't, spanning what looked like 18 months, copies of financial records, a handwritten note she almost missed, tucked inside the back cover, on her father's personal stationery. She recognized the handwriting because it was the same handwriting that had signed every loan document she'd seen in Damien's office. The note was addressed to Damien. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it back. Everything Maris needs to know is in the necklace. Keep her safe. Don't tell her yet. She won't trust you, and she needs to trust you before she understands. I'm sorry for the weight of this. T." The door behind her opened. She spun around. It wasn't Damien. It was Marco, the head of security, with his arms at his sides and an expression she had never seen on his professional face before. Not the courteous blankness of an employee, not the alert neutrality of a security operative, but something open and cold and fixed. "Mrs. Viscari," he said, "you shouldn't be in here." "Marco," she said. Her voice came out even, which was a feat, because her heart was hitting the inside of her ribs like something trying to get out. "I have authorization." "You have a key card," he said. "That's not the same thing." He stepped forward, and she registered 2 things at the same moment: that he was between her and the door, and that his right hand was moving toward his jacket. She didn't think. She moved. The workstation chair was on wheels. She shoved it hard toward him as she went left, felt it catch him at the shin, and was past him and through the door and up the basement stairs in 15 seconds of pure, adrenalized motion that she felt in her legs and her lungs and the back of her throat. She made it to the main corridor, and she was 3 steps from the staircase when the lights in the hallway went out. Complete darkness. Not a power failure, a deliberate cut. She pressed herself against the wall and breathed through her nose, short and controlled, and heard footsteps on the floor above her that were moving fast. And then a hand closed on her arm from the right, and she was already pulling away when a voice said, very low and very close, "It's me. Don't move. Damien." His grip on her arm was firm but not rough. In the dark, she could feel the heat of him and the controlled tension in his body and smell something chemical. Gunpowder, she realized, or whatever was adjacent to it. "Where's Marco?" she said, barely audible. Not a concern right now. His voice was the quietest she'd ever heard it. There are 2 men in the house who don't work here. We're going upstairs. She let him move her. Through the dark, up the stairs, into the corridor of the residential wing, where some emergency lighting cast a faint red-orange wash along the floor. He moved fast and without hesitation and kept himself between her and the direction of the footsteps she could hear somewhere below. In her room, door closed and locked, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. "Marco," she said. "He's been working for my uncle for at least 8 months." Damien was at the window, checking the grounds, his back to her. "Possibly longer. We didn't know. I found a folder in the archive, my father's name. There was a note inside. He turned. "He wrote to you," she said. "My father. He said whatever I need to know is in a necklace." She pressed her hands together to stop them from shaking. "He said to keep me safe." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing she'd ever sat inside. Damien crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, elbows on his knees, and for the first time since she'd met him, the controlled surface had cracks in it. Not many, not wide, but there, in the set of his jaw and the slight compression around his eyes. "Your father isn't missing," he said. "He went into hiding voluntarily 8 months ago after discovering something that made staying visible extremely dangerous." He held her gaze. "He came to me before he disappeared. He asked me to find you a way into my protection without you knowing that's what it was." A pause. "Because he knew if you understood you were being protected, you'd refuse it." She stared at him. The contract, the debt, the arranged marriage that had felt like coercion and calculation, and the removal of her choices. "The debt," she said. "Real," he said. "The loans were real. But the offer, the marriage, that wasn't how I would have handled a debt collection. Your father proposed it. He said it was the only context in which you'd agree to stay somewhere safe without fighting your way back out." She stood up. She needed to stand up. "He manipulated me," she said. "It came out very quiet, which was worse than if it had been loud. He was trying to keep you alive. Those are not mutually exclusive." Her voice was still quiet. "You took my choice. You both took my choice, and you let me live here for 3 weeks thinking." "I know," Damien said. "Don't." She turned around. "Don't make it sound simple." He didn't say anything. He just watched her, with that face she'd spent 3 weeks learning to read and apparently still couldn't, and she felt the full weight of everything she'd built in this house. The careful provisional calm, the patient intelligence gathering, the tentative and reluctant reorientation of her understanding of this man, shift and crack and restructure under this new information. Her father had chosen this. Her father had engineered this. And Damien had agreed. And somewhere in this house, the head of security had been feeding information to the man who wanted them both dead. And somewhere in the city, her father was hiding. And in her room, on her dresser, in the antique oval frame she'd carried with her since she was 19, her mother's necklace, the one she'd worn on her wedding day because it was the one thing she had left. She turned and looked at the dresser. The photograph of her mother was still there. The necklace was gone. "Damien," she said very carefully. He was already looking at the dresser. "Marco," he said, and was on his feet. From somewhere in this east wing, the sound of breaking glass was followed by something that took her a half-second to identify, and then identified with total certainty. A gunshot, then a second, then an alarm she hadn't known the house had shrieking into life around them both, and every provisional thing she had built in 3 careful weeks was gone, and they were in it now, fully and without retreat. And the necklace that apparently held whatever her father had died to protect was somewhere in this house in the hands of a man who had just announced himself as the enemy. The alarm was still shrieking when Damien moved. He crossed the room in 4 strides, pulled open the door, and was in the corridor before Maris had fully processed what was happening. And then her legs were moving too. Because standing still in a room with a broken window somewhere in the east wing and a traitor in the house was not a survivable option, and she had already decided somewhere in the last 3 weeks that survival was the one thing she would not negotiate on. The corridor was red-lit and loud. 2 of Damien's security men came from the far end at a run, both armed, and Damien met them in 3 clipped exchanges she had to work to follow. East wing breach, Marco compromised, the necklace, find him before he gets to the perimeter, and then one of them peeled off toward the east wing and the other fell into position behind Damien and Maris as they moved toward the main staircase. Stay close, Damien said, without looking at her. Don't separate from me regardless of what you see or hear. The necklace. I know. It was my mother's. It was on my dresser. Maris. He stopped at the top of the stairs and turned and looked at her directly, and his face in the red emergency light was stripped of its usual control in a way she'd never seen. Not panicked. Panic wasn't a register he seemed to operate in, but urgent in a way that was almost physical. I understand. We will get it back. Right now I need you to focus. She breathed, nodded, focused. They went down. Sit. The east wing's ground floor was a wreck of overturned furniture and a shattered window that let in cold night air and the smell of rain-wet stone. The security man who'd gone ahead was crouched near the window frame, and when he looked up at Damien, his expression said what his words confirmed a second later. He's gone. Made it over the east wall. Vehicle waiting on the service road. He held up his hand. In his palm, a chain. Silver, thin, with the oval locket pendant snapped clean off. Found this on the floor. Maris stopped breathing for a moment. Just the chain. The locket was gone. Her mother had worn that locket every day for 19 years. Maris had worn it to her wedding. Whatever her father had hidden inside it, whatever encrypted record he'd trusted to a piece of jewelry rather than to any digital system that could be traced or hacked or subpoenaed, was now in the hands of a man who worked for Lucien Viscari. She took the chain from the security man's palm and closed her fingers around it, and felt the small broken clasp dig into her skin, and she held on to that sensation because it was concrete and real, and everything else was moving too fast for her to hold. How long? Damien asked. 3 minutes? Maybe 4? He won't go to Lucien directly. He'll go to ground first, wait for contact. Damien was already pulling out his phone. Get Reyes on the service road cameras, every direction. I want the vehicle make and plate in 10 minutes. He made 2 more calls in rapid succession as they moved back through the house, and Maris followed and cataloged what she was feeling, which was rage, clean and cold, and more clarifying than anything she'd felt since she'd walked into his office 3 weeks ago. And she held it carefully, the way you hold something that will be useful if you don't let it burn you first. In the kitchen, under the overhead lights with the alarm finally cut to silence, Damien set his phone down and looked at her across the counter. Tell me about the necklace, he said. Everything you know. It was my mother's. She left it to me. I've worn it since she died. She kept her voice flat. My father's note said whatever I need to know is in the necklace. I don't know what that means. I opened the locket once, years ago. There was a photograph inside, just a photograph of my parents. A photograph or something behind a photograph. She stopped. She thought about the locket, the way the interior had always felt slightly resistant when she'd tried to press the photograph back into place. The faint resistance she'd attributed to the age of the hinge mechanism. She'd never thought to look beneath it. Why would she? It was her mother's jewelry, not a safe deposit box. I don't know, she said. Your father hid something inside it. Something he believed was worth using you as cover to protect. He held her gaze. Whatever it is, Lucien's people will have it disassembled within the hour. The hour. She thought about that. About encrypted financial records. That was what the outline had said. What she'd vaguely understood this to be about financial evidence, corruption, being fed into whatever system Lucien used, and everything her father had sacrificed his normal life to protect evaporating in the hands of the people it was meant to expose. Can you intercept Marco before he transfers it? We're trying. He picked up his phone again, checked it, set it back down. It depends on where he runs to ground. And if you can't? He looked at her steadily. Then we move to the contingency. Which is? Your father, he said. He's the only other person who knows exactly what the evidence contains. If the necklace is compromised, we need him. She stared at him. You said you didn't know where he is. I said that in a context where I wasn't certain whether you were safe, he said. I need you to understand the distinction. The rage she'd been holding carefully got a little harder to hold. You lied to me. I withheld information under conditions where disclosing it could have gotten you killed. That is a very tidy way of describing a lie. Yes, he said. It is. He didn't look away. I'm telling you now. She pressed the chain in her palm hard enough to leave marks. Where is he? A safe house, 3 hours from here. He's been there for 8 months. He paused. He wanted to contact you. I wouldn't let him until I was certain the house was secure. Another pause. And this one had something in it she hadn't heard in his voice before. Something that wasn't quite apology, but was in the same neighborhood. I was wrong about the house being secure. Marco has been there for 4 years. He came with strong references from a previous employer who I now believe was already in Lucien's network. He said it without excuse or deflection, which she registered because a lesser man would have deflected. I missed it. She looked at him across the counter in the bright kitchen light. This man she'd spent 3 weeks cataloging and distrusting and reluctantly, incrementally updating her understanding of, and she said, "Call my father." The call happened in Damien's office on the ground floor with the door closed and 2 of his remaining security people outside it. He dialed a number she didn't recognize, and when the connection opened, the breathing on the other end was so immediately, achingly familiar that Maris had to press her palm flat against the desk to stay upright. "Thomas," Damien said, "we have a problem." A pause. Then her father's voice, and he sounded older. Not just tired, but older in some bone-deep way. Like a man who had been carrying weight in a small room for a long time. "How bad?" "Marco. He's gone to ground with the necklace." The silence on the other end was total. "Dad," Maris said. Another silence, different in texture. Loaded. Then very quietly. "Maris." "I'm here." She kept her voice steady. "I'm fine. I need you to tell me what's in the necklace." "Maris, I'm so—" "Later," she said. "Tell me what's in the necklace." She heard him breathe. In the safe house 3 hours away, her father, who had borrowed $31 million from dangerous people, who had vanished from her life for months, who had apparently engineered her marriage to a crime boss as some form of protection scheme, gathered himself. "There's a microfilm negative behind the photograph," he said. 18 months ago, I was approached about participating in a financial syndicate. International capital movement, I was told. Legitimate. I was in enough trouble by then that I was willing to believe it. His voice was controlled, but she could hear what was under it. The specific humiliation of a man recounting his own willful blindness. "I started doing due diligence on my own after the first wire transfer. What I found, Maris, the amounts, the connections, it's not just Lucien. It's legislators, law enforcement at the federal level, international banking infrastructure. The syndicate has been running for 11 years. And you put the evidence on a microfilm and hid it in Mom's necklace," she said. "It was the only thing I had that I knew would go to you if something happened to me. You'd worn it every day since she died. I knew you'd keep it safe even if you didn't know why." A pause. "I knew they'd come for any digital record. Microfilm can't be remotely wiped." She closed her eyes briefly. Her father's optimism, his flexibility, his genius for creating problems and then solving them sideways, all of it distilled into a piece of maternal jewelry turned evidence vault. She could hate it and appreciate its elegance at the same time. "If Marco gets it to Lucien," she said, "then the only copies of that evidence are gone. Every name on that list walks away clean, and anyone who knew about it becomes a liability that needs eliminating." His voice went very quiet. "Which means you, Maris. Which means Damien. Which means me." The office was very still. "Can you come in?" Damien asked. "We need to move before Lucien knows what Marco has. If we reach him before he reaches Lucien—" "I can be there in 3 hours," her father said. "But Damien, there's something else. Something I didn't put in the note because I didn't know how to write it." Another pause, the heaviest yet. "About your parents." Damien's stillness changed quality. "Say it." "The syndicate that Lucien built, the 11-year network, it wasn't the first attempt. There was an earlier version, 12 years ago." Thomas's voice was careful and precise now, like a man reading from a document he'd memorized against his will. There were two people who found out about it before it could be established, who refused to participate and threatened to go public. They were killed. A pause that lasted too long. A car accident, the official report said, on Route 9 outside the city, 12 years ago. The silence that followed was absolute. Maris looked at Damien. His face had gone somewhere she had never seen it go. Not the controlled blankness, not the alert stillness. Something beneath both of those, something old and raw and barely contained. His hands on the desk were flat and very still. "Their names," he said. His voice was almost unrecognizable. Same register, same volume, but something underneath it had stripped away. "Antonio and Clara Vescari," her father said. Maris watched Damien's jaw tighten. She watched the tendons in his hands go rigid. She watched him absorb the confirmation of something she now understood he had suspected but never been able to prove, that his parents' deaths 12 years ago had not been an accident, that Lucien had not been a grieving brother-in-law, that the uncle who had sat at his dinner table Thursday evening and smiled at her and called her extraordinary had ordered the deaths of his own family members to protect an empire he was still building. Damien stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her and said nothing. "Damien," her father's voice came from the phone on the desk. "I'm sorry. I've been sitting with this for 8 months. I didn't—" "Get to us," Damien said, without turning around. His voice had come back to its surface, controlled even, but it was the control of someone holding something down by force. 3 hours, don't stop. He ended the call. Maris sat in the silence with him for a moment. She wasn't sure what to offer. She wasn't a person who trafficked in comfort, had never been good at the soft currencies of consolation. And she looked at his back and his rigid hands and the set of his shoulders, and she said the only thing that seemed honest. "I'm sorry," she said. He didn't turn around. "They refused to join," he said. "That's what it costs. Refusing." She didn't answer, because there was no answer for that. She just stayed in the room, which felt like the least inadequate thing she could do. He moved with complete operational efficiency for the next 2 hours, which she now understood was how he metabolized things that were too large to process directly. He briefed his remaining security team, 3 men after Marco's defection, which was a skeletal number for a house this size, and she could see the calculation in his face when he looked at them. He made calls she wasn't present for. He had the East Wing breach secured. He arranged for her father's transit route. At 4 in the morning, he came and found her in the kitchen, where she'd been sitting with coffee and Tuck's heavy head in her lap. And he sat across from her and she poured him coffee without asking, and he took it without commenting. And they sat like that in the early morning kitchen quiet for a few minutes before either of them spoke. "The dinner Thursday," she said. "Lucien knew about the necklace already. He's known about the evidence for months. He just didn't know the form it was in or where your father had put it." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Marco must have been watching you from day one, waiting for you to lead him to it." She thought about the 12 days she'd spent walking the gardens, reading in the library, sitting at this kitchen table with her laptop and her accounts. Under observation the entire time. "He never saw me touch the necklace except to wear it." "He saw enough?" A pause. "Celine warned you on the terrace." "I know she did. She does that." "Why is she in Lucien's orbit if she's warning his targets?" He looked at her steadily. "That's a question with a complicated answer." "We have time." He considered. "Celine was with me, briefly, 4 years ago, before I understood how close Lucien was to making his move. When I ended it, she moved into his circle. I thought it was anger. I've had reasons recently to wonder if it was strategy." He paused. "She's not what she appears to be. Beyond that, I genuinely don't know." Maris filed this. "And you trust her?" "I don't trust anyone completely," he said. "But I've stopped assuming she's working against me." She thought about Celine's face on the terrace, that look of bone-deep exhaustion, the weight of something long carried. "I am very, very tired of watching that happen." The kitchen clock read 4:27. "My father will be here by 7, she said, "if he's not intercepted." The flatness with which he said it made her look up. "You think Lucien knows he's moving?" "Marco has been out of contact for 2 hours. Lucien will know we're aware of the breach. He'll anticipate that we'd call your father." He set down his cup. I've sent 2 of my people to meet him en route. It's the best I can do with the personnel I have. She looked at him. How many people does Lucian have? More than I do currently. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact requiring acknowledgement. He's been consolidating for 6 years. I've been managing rather than countering. It's a strategic error I made because I underestimated how far he was willing to go. He looked down at his cup. I keep making that error. The car accident, she said carefully. Your parents. You knew it wasn't an accident. I suspected it for years. I couldn't prove it. He was quiet for a moment. He sat at my table. He came to my parents' funeral. He told me about how devastated he was, and I sat across from him and He stopped. His jaw was tight. I suspected. I didn't know. Suspicion without evidence means nothing in the world I operate in. It means something, she said. Just not enough. He looked at her. She held his gaze. It's different, she said. Suspecting and knowing. I know that better than most people right now. Something in his face shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Not gratitude, not warmth, but recognition. The look of a man who has been seen accurately for the first time in a while and doesn't quite know what to do with it. Her father arrived at 6:48. He was thinner than she remembered. 3 months hadn't done that. 8 months had. 8 months in a safe house eating whatever Damien's supply chain provided, sleeping badly, carrying the weight of what he knew. His hair had gone from salt and pepper to almost entirely white. He walked into the house's entrance hall and stopped when he saw her, and his face did something complicated and painful. She stood there and looked at him. She wanted to cross the room. She also wanted to say 14 specific things that were not gentle, and several of which she'd been composing in her head for months, since his calls stopped and her world started coming apart. Both impulses ran up against each other, and what came out was simply, Dad. Maris. His voice cracked on the second syllable. He crossed the distance first, and she let him, and when his arms went around her, she held on and hated how much she needed to hold on, because being needed to hold on to something was a vulnerability she had been carefully refusing for months, and here it was anyway, unavoidable. She let herself have 4 seconds of it, then she stepped back. Sit down, she said. Tell me everything. Touch. He told them everything. It took an hour and 2 refilled coffee cups and several moments where his voice went into a register she'd only heard from him twice before in her life. Once at her mother's bedside, once at the graveside. The register of a man facing the full architecture of his own mistakes without the buffer of hope. The syndicate had approached him 19 months ago when he was at his most desperate. 3 loans underwater, the vineyard's future genuinely uncertain, the accumulated wreckage of 5 years of bad decisions bearing down on him all at once. The approach came through a man he'd met at a business conference, someone who'd seemed legitimate, whose credentials checked out through normal channels because Lucien's network had made sure they would. The first 3 months he'd been a willing participant, believing the framing he'd been given. Then he'd started asking questions his contact couldn't answer cleanly, and he'd begun his own investigation, and what he found, the laundering infrastructure, the political connections, the law enforcement figures named as operational partners, had terrified him so thoroughly that he'd done something she now understood was both his worst and most characteristic impulse. Instead of going to the authorities he didn't know he could trust, he'd gone sideways, found Damien through a chain of careful intermediaries, and constructed a plan that was equal parts ingenious and catastrophic. You used me, she said, flat, not loud. I protected you, he said. I know that's not the same thing. No, it's not. He looked at her. In the morning light, he looked old in a way he hadn't a year ago, and she felt the grief of that alongside the anger, and didn't let either cancel the other out. I know you're furious, he said. I'm not furious, she said. I'm something worse than furious. I'm the person who had to live inside a plan she didn't consent to, for months without understanding why. She kept her voice even. We'll deal with that later. Right now I need to know about the microfilm. He nodded, and she watched him accept the deferral with the quiet of a man who knew he owed it. The microfilm contained 18 months of financial records, encrypted transaction logs, and, most critically, a series of communications between Lucien's financial lieutenant and officials across 3 federal agencies. Names, dates, transaction references. A complete map of the syndicate's corruption infrastructure. Without it, Damien said, what do we have? My testimony, Thomas said, which is the word of a man who voluntarily participated in the syndicate for 3 months and then ran instead of going to law enforcement. It's worthless. He looked at his hands. It's worse than worthless. They'll bury me in my own involvement before I get a second sentence out. Silence. Maris looked at the table. She thought about the chain still in her pocket. Her mother's silver chain, snapped, without the locket. She thought about the way she'd felt the hinge resistance for years without understanding it. She thought about Marco's hand reaching toward his jacket in the archive room, and the photograph slid under her door, and Celine's face on the terrace, and Damien standing at his office window with his hands rigid on the glass. There's another copy, she said. Both men looked at her. She hadn't planned to say it. She said it because it had surfaced from somewhere, a detail, an image, a half-formed intuition she'd been carrying without naming. My father said he didn't trust digital records. He put the evidence on microfilm. Microfilm has to be developed from a negative. She looked at her father. You would have made more than one. Thomas was very still. You made more than one, she said. He closed his eyes, and then, slowly, he said, There's a second negative, in Zurich, in a safety deposit box under your mother's name. He opened his eyes. I set it up the week before I disappeared. I used her name because it can't be accessed without biometric verification from a direct family member. He looked at her. From you. She absorbed this. You were going to tell me. When it was safe. When did you decide it was never going to be safe enough? He didn't answer. She sat with it for a moment. The second negative, the Zurich box, her mother's name as a last quiet line of defense, and then she looked at Damien. We need to get to Zurich, she said. Lucien will anticipate that move the moment he gets the necklace open and finds a single negative, Damien said. He'll know there's a second. He'll move to intercept. How long does it take to get a microfilm locket open without destroying the contents? A pause. If they're careful, several hours. If they're not, they risk ruining the negative. Then we have a window. He looked at her with the gray eyes she'd spent 3 weeks reading, and she watched him calculate, which she had learned was how he arrived at decisions. Not impulse, not emotion, but the cold assembly of variables into a probability she could see him running. The 5 families' annual gathering, he said slowly. It's in 4 days. Lucien will have to attend. Every major player in the regional network will be there, which means his operational capacity will be split between the event and whatever he sends after you. He was quiet for a moment. If we move in the next 24 hours... The window from the sitting room to his left exploded inward, then the one at the end of the hall. Maris was already moving, not away from Damien, but toward her father, covering the instinct she'd apparently built without knowing, when the front door came in with a crack of metal that meant the lock had been blown, not kicked, and she understood in the half-second of pure adrenalized clarity that followed that Lucien had not waited for Marco to deliver the necklace. He had simply decided he was done waiting. The next 40 seconds were the most disordered of her life. Damien was shouting instructions to his security men, who were already positioned. He'd had them staged, she realized, because he'd anticipated this, had been anticipating it from the moment he'd understood Marco was compromised, and that forward thinking was the only reason they weren't dead in the first 20 seconds. She pulled her father behind the kitchen island and got low, and felt the percussion of 2 shots fired somewhere in the entrance hall vibrate through the floor under her knees. Tuck was barking from the locked utility room where she'd put him an hour ago, frantic and continuous. Then Damien was in the kitchen doorway, and his face said what she would have asked him. They were outnumbered, the perimeter was breached on 3 sides, and the house was no longer defensible. Backstairs, he said. The garage. Now. My father, I know, let's go. She took her father's arm and they went. The back stairs were clear. The garage was below grade, accessible through a utility corridor that Damien moved through with the certainty of someone who'd run this route in his head many times, and she followed without questioning his knowledge of his own house because this was not the moment for independence over survival. The garage held 4 vehicles. He went to the third, a gray SUV she hadn't seen before, and the keys were already in it. She understood. This was a prepared route, a prepared vehicle, something he'd had staged before she'd even come downstairs tonight. The discovery of Marco's betrayal had activated contingencies he'd set up long before tonight's crisis. "Where are we going?" her father asked, breathing hard, sliding into the back seat. Damien started the engine. The garage door opened on a side alley that ran parallel to the east wall, away from the front of the house where the breach was happening. "Away from here first," he said. "Then we decide." Maris was in the passenger seat, and the SUV was moving before she registered that she'd chosen to get in without being asked, which was a decision she noted only because 3 weeks ago she would have fought it. They cleared the alley. The street beyond was empty in the early morning gray, and Damien turned without hesitation in a direction she didn't recognize, and the house behind them receded, and she could see in the mirror that smoke was beginning to rise from one of the upper windows. "Your house," she said. "It's a building," he said. She looked at his profile, the jaw, the controlled set of it, the eyes moving between road and mirror, and she thought about what her father had said about his parents, the price of refusing. 12 years of operating inside a world that had taken everything from him before he was old enough to choose, building something back from scratch, and now that too was burning. She looked forward. "The gathering," she said, for some 4 days. 3 now. It's past midnight. "Lucien will be there?" "Yes." "If we have the second negative, if we can get to Zurich and back, then we have something to bring," he said. She thought about what her father had said. Federal agencies compromised, politicians connected. The people who would normally be the obvious destination for this evidence were potentially on the list the evidence named, which meant the delivery mechanism mattered as much as the evidence itself. "The gathering," she said again. "All 5 families." He glanced at her. "If the evidence goes out to every law enforcement database simultaneously, during an event where every major network player is in one location," she stopped, worked it through. "They can't suppress it if it's everywhere at once. They can't bury it if it's already in the hands of every agency simultaneously." Damien was quiet for a long moment. "That's not a plan," he said. "That's a detonation." "Yes," she said. He looked at the road. In the back seat, her father was silent with the specific silence of a man who understood finally that his daughter was no longer someone who needed protecting from the weight of a decision. She looked at the road too, at the city moving past them in the early morning gray, at the world outside the glass that had been trying to kill her for 3 weeks without quite succeeding, and she felt something settle into place inside her chest. Not peace, nothing as soft as peace, but something load-bearing. She hadn't come into this situation with a choice, but she had one now, and she was making it with her eyes completely open, and Lucien Vescari, who had killed Damien's parents for refusing, who had burned a house to take back evidence of his own crimes, who had been patient for 6 years and was still, apparently, making the same fundamental error of underestimating the people he decided were variables, had not yet understood what he was actually dealing with. Not a contract bride. Not a vineyard owner's frightened daughter. Not a woman who could be maneuvered into position and managed. Someone who had learned in 3 brutal weeks exactly how to read a room she'd never been trained for. Outside the window, the first gray edge of dawn was showing above the city's eastern line. And somewhere ahead of them was an airport, and somewhere in Zurich was a safety deposit box in her dead mother's name. And somewhere behind them, Lucien Vescari was standing in the wreckage of a house and believing he had won. He was wrong, but she was going to let him believe it for exactly 3 more days. They flew out of a private airfield 40 minutes east of the city at 7:12 in the morning. In a 6-seat aircraft that belonged to a shell company, Damien made 2 phone calls to activate, and Maris sat in the narrow seat with her mother's broken chain wrapped around her fingers and watched the city drop away beneath them and felt nothing romantic about the altitude. Her father fell asleep 20 minutes in, which she found both irritating and deeply characteristic. Thomas Ellington had always been able to sleep under pressure. She'd inherited her mother's insomnia instead, the kind that turned every quiet hour into an inventory of everything unresolved. She used the flight time. Damien sat across from her with a laptop open and his phone on the armrest in the specific focused exhaustion of someone running on no sleep and controlled adrenaline, and she watched him work for a while before she said, Tell me about the gathering. He looked up. Annual event, hosted on a rotating basis among the 5 families. This year it's at the Cavendish, the private event space on the 44th floor of the tower downtown. Invitation only, plus designated guests. Approximately 60 to 80 people. Security? Extensive. The families all bring their own. The venue adds a layer. It's historically neutral ground. Weapons are checked at the door, or are supposed to be. Supposed to be. Events in which everyone in attendance has reasons to cheat tend to be somewhat self-regulating on that point, he said. Nobody wants to be the first to draw because they can't guarantee who else is armed. She thought about 60 to 80 people in a single room. The logistics of what she'd proposed, broadcasting the financial records simultaneously to every law enforcement database, required network access, required a transmission point, required someone with technical capacity she didn't personally have. The Cavendish has its own server infrastructure, Damien said, as if following her thought. High bandwidth, private network for events. If the records were introduced into that system and simultaneously pushed through the building's external connections. Can you do that? I can't. I know someone who can. He paused. Reyes. He's been with me for 6 years. He's also the only person on my current team whose loyalty I'd stake this on, and I'm aware that's a sentence I said about Marco 4 years ago. Where is he? Already in the city. He got out of the house before the breach fully closed. He held her gaze. He's the best option we have. What do we need from Zurich? A high-resolution digital scan of the negative. I have the scanning equipment. Reyes needs the data file. The negative itself gives us nothing without conversion. He closed the laptop. We get in, we scan it, we get out. We have a 3-hour window before Lucian's people can logically anticipate the Zurich move. You think he'll have someone there? I think he'll try. The box is in your mother's name with biometric access. He can't get in without you, which means he needs to wait for you to show up. A pause. Which means he'll have someone watching the bank, not inside it. She absorbed this. So we go in fast. We go in looking like we're not in a hurry, he said. People running draw attention. People who look like they belong take longer to flag. She looked at him across the narrow aircraft cabin. He had a bruise developing along his left jaw that she hadn't noticed in the chaos of the night, and there was a cut on the back of his right hand that had dried without being properly cleaned, and he hadn't slept in at least 20 hours. And he was still running probability calculations with the focused precision of someone who was simply not going to permit himself to stop. Your parents, she said. His jaw tightened. Not dramatically. Just the one, small, controlled movement she now recognized as his version of a flinch. You've known for 12 years that it probably wasn't an accident, she said. You built everything you have in the last 12 years knowing that. Knowing is different from what I said. I suspected. Stop correcting me on that. She held his gaze. I'm saying you built something real while carrying something like that. I want you to know that I see that. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the aircraft windows, the clouds were solid and gray. Thank you, he said, which was 2 words, and quietly spoken, and somehow the most unguarded thing she'd heard from him in 4 weeks. She looked back at the clouds. Ultit. Zurich was cold and precise, and exactly as Maris expected a city to be when it had spent centuries perfecting the art of minding its own business about other people's money. They landed at a private facility outside the city, and a car was waiting, arranged through channels she didn't ask about. And they drove in without her father, who stayed with the aircraft and the pilot, and a phone number to call if they weren't back in 90 minutes. She had her mother's broken chain in her jacket pocket. She had her passport, which had been in her room's document folder, and which Damien had retrieved before they'd left through the garage. She had the specific tightness across her shoulders that she'd learned to identify as her body's preparation for something. The bank was on a street that looked like every other street in this part of the city. Clean, old, discreet in the specific way of institutions that have never needed to advertise. They walked in through the front entrance at 10:47 local time, and Maris felt Damien's hand briefly at the small of her back. Not possessive, just a physical indication of proximity, before he let it drop. She approached the desk and stated her business in English, which was accepted without comment, and provided the identification required, and was taken to a private room by a bank employee who could have been anywhere between 35 and 55, and had the face of a man who had never once found his work interesting. The box was small, standard size, her mother's name on the register. The biometric scan was her fingerprint and a retinal check, both of which she provided, and the employee set the box on the table and left them. She opened it. Inside, a small paper envelope, sealed with tape. Inside the envelope, a strip of microfilm negative approximately 4 inches long and a protective sleeve. Damien had the scanner out before she'd finished looking at it. A compact device, professional grade, the kind she'd seen document archivists use. He set it on the table and she handed him the sleeve, and he worked with quiet efficiency, the film going through the scanner in 2 passes, and then he was transferring the file to an encrypted drive, and she was watching the door and the time. 61 minutes since they'd entered the building. Done, he said. She replaced the negative in the envelope, put it back in the box, closed the box, and pressed the call button for the employee. On the street, 2 minutes later, walking at the pace of people who had ordinary business to return to, she said quietly, "Someone's watching." Gray coat, north side of the street, been moving parallel to us since we exited. Damien didn't look. Don't look. I know, 2 of them. The second is 30 feet behind. He was quiet for a moment. You picked up the second one? He has the same shoes as the first, expensive ones. People in expensive shoes don't walk 30 feet behind someone in gray coats unless they're connected. She kept her face forward. They're Lucien's? Or contracted by him. Same outcome either way. The car was 2 blocks north. They had 2 followers who hadn't moved to intercept yet, which meant they were watching rather than acting, which meant Lucien wanted to see where the drive went rather than simply taking it here. When we get to the car, she said, do we run or do we look like we don't know? We look like we don't know, for 2 more blocks. She matched his pace exactly. Around them, the city moved in its clean, efficient morning, citizens and tourists and bankers with briefcases, and she walked through it with her heart rate elevated and her hands in her pockets and every sense she had arrayed outward. And she thought about 4 weeks ago when the worst problem in her life was a broken irrigation controller and $31 million in debt. The car. Inside. Damien in the driver's seat. They pulled out into traffic, and 3 seconds later a second vehicle 2 cars behind them pulled out too. Gray sedan, she said. Yes. Lucien doesn't want the drive, she said. He wants to follow us to Reyes. Yes. So we don't go to Reyes. No. He made a turn that wasn't toward the airfield. We lose them first. What followed was 22 minutes she would remember in fragments, a series of turns through streets she couldn't name, the gray sedan maintaining distance with the patience of professionals, Damien driving with the hands low, low-throttle calm of someone trained rather than panicked, and herself sitting in the passenger seat doing the only useful thing she could do, which was tracking the sedan's position in the mirror and reporting every change without editorializing. They lost the sedan in the older district, in a warren of narrow streets where 2 quick consecutive turns put a tram between them and their followers, and Damien held their new direction for 3 minutes before he exhaled slowly, and she felt the tension in the car decompress by a fraction. Did they get a destination? She asked. No. Will Lucien know we have the scan? He knows we went to the bank. He knows what was there. A pause. He knows we have it. What he doesn't know is what we're going to do with it. She thought about the gathering. 3 days. Then 2, now. Call Reyes, she said. Up. They were back in the city by evening, landing at the same private airfield with her father awake and anxious in the back of the waiting car, and by 9 that night they were in the second location Damien had prepared, a nondescript apartment in a residential district that he accessed through a management company that kept no records of tenants. And Reyes was at the table. Rafael Reyes was 32 and small and had the specific energy of someone whose brain ran faster than most people's bodies. He had a laptop open before he sat down, and when Damien set the encrypted drive in front of him, he plugged it in and started working without preamble. Maris watched him work for 15 minutes and then went to the apartment's small window and looked at the street below. Ordinary, residential, a woman walking a dog, a man with grocery bags, and allowed herself 3 minutes of something adjacent to stillness before she turned back. Her father was at the table across from Reyes, watching the screen. He looked better than he had that morning. Some color back, some of the weight redistributed from his face to his shoulders where he apparently kept it better. He caught her eye and held it, and she read the question in his face, and she shook her head slightly. Not yet. Because the thing he wanted her to say, the absolution, the it's all right, the weight reduction of her forgiveness, was something she wasn't ready to give, and she was done giving things she wasn't ready for. How long to configure the transmission? Damien asked Reyes. For what you're describing, get me into the Cavendish network in 20 minutes. Reyes didn't look up. Getting into the Cavendish network is the part that takes time. How much time? Depends on their security protocols. 2 days minimum if I start now. He finally looked up. Is this actually happening? You want to detonate a financial record in the middle of a 5-family gathering? Yes. Reyes looked at Damien for a long moment, then at Maris, then back at Damien. Okay, he said, and looked back at his screen. I need coffee, and nobody needs to talk to me. What? The next 36 hours ran on coffee and short sleep and the specific anxiety of waiting, which Maris had always found harder than action. Reyes worked. Damien managed a network of contacts she couldn't fully see, arranging things she understood in outline only. The approach to specific federal investigators who were verifiably not on the syndicate's list through channels clean enough to hold. Her father spent 12 hours on a secured line with the Department of Justice attorney Damien had vetted through a contact she'd trust with his life, laying groundwork. She did what she was good at. She read the records. Reyes had extracted and decrypted the microfilm scan into readable files, and she went through them with the same methodical attention she'd applied to the Vineyard's destroyed financial records 2 years ago, following transaction threads, matching names to the network architecture Damien had sketched for her, building a map she could navigate when she needed to describe it under oath or under pressure. She built it in her head because paper could be taken and drives could be wiped, and what was in her memory was the hardest thing to compromise. 14 hours in, she found something in the records that her father hadn't mentioned. A series of transactions, smaller than the main flows, tagged with a code she almost missed because it looked like an internal accounting reference. She cross-referenced against the communication logs in the same file set and found the key. The code corresponded to a protected identity, an asset, someone inside Lucian's network who was not of Lucian's network. The asset's transactions showed payment flows going in both directions, into Lucian's accounts and out to an entity she recognized after 20 minutes of cross-referencing as a federal investigative fund, an undercover operative, inside Lucian's circle, for at least 3 years. She looked at the transaction initiation dates, looked at the account identifiers, looked at the approximate profile they implied. Someone socially connected to Lucian, mobile within his circle, with access to his financial conversations. She sat back from the laptop. Damien, she said. He came over. She pointed at the screen and let him read. She watched his face as he did it, the slight recalibration, the working through. Celine, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression that was too layered to read quickly. Old grief and recalibrated understanding, and something that might have been relief, and something that might have been anger at all the time he'd spent not knowing. She's been working for federal investigators, he said, for 3 years. Since before she moved into Lucian's circle. Maris held his gaze. She didn't go to him out of anger when you ended things. She went because someone asked her to. He absorbed this silently. Did she know about your parents? Maris asked. I don't know. He sat down. I don't know what she knows. We need to contact her. If Lucian's watching her, he won't be, not the night of the gathering. He'll have his attention on the event, on you, on whether we show up. She leaned forward. She's our inside. If she knows what we're planning and she can position herself correctly, she could be killed, he said, if it goes wrong. She's already in a position where she could be killed, Maris said. She's been in that position for 3 years. Let her decide. He looked at her for a long moment. When did you get this comfortable with high-stakes decisions? I grew up on a farm, she said. Every decision is high stakes. You just don't usually have the option of not making it. He reached for his phone. Chas. The gathering was at 8. They were in position by 6. Reyes was in a vehicle 4 blocks from the Cavendish Tower with a direct wireless link to the building's infrastructure, a connection he'd spent 40 hours building through the tower's maintenance network. Not through the event space itself, but through the building-wide systems that the event space ran on, an access vector that the venue's security team apparently hadn't considered. He needed 20 minutes once Damien gave him the signal. Damien had promised him 20 minutes. Maris was in a car in the tower's underground parking structure, with her father beside her and a security man named Ortega in the front, and she was wearing a black dress that Damien had sourced through a contact she hadn't asked about, because the gathering had a dress code and they needed to not look like people who had spent the last 36 hours in a surveillance apartment. She looked like she belonged. She'd practiced that in the mirror. Damien had gone in first, an hour ahead, through the main entrance, because his presence was anticipated. He was a family head, he had a standing invitation, and his absence would have been more alarming than his attendance. She'd watched him walk into the lobby from the parking structure entrance with the focused stillness of a man walking into something he'd chosen and had no intention of losing. Celine's contact response had come back in 6 hours. Understood, I know my position. Don't signal me. I'll find the right moment. At 7:58, Maris walked in through the service entrance with her father, using credentials Reyes had spent most of the previous night manufacturing, and they took the service elevator to the 44th floor, and the door opened into a corridor that smelled of catered food and expensive perfume and the specific electric charge of a room full of people with too much power and too much to protect. She checked her phone. One message from Damien. In position, east side of the main room. Lucienne arrived 20 minutes ago. She typed back, coming in. The service corridor opened onto the back edge of the event space through a door disguised as part of the wall paneling. She opened it 3 inches, looked through, and saw the room. It was everything the word gathering undersold. The 44th floor of the Cavendish Tower was glass on 3 sides. The city spread below in a grid of light, and inside 60-odd people moved through a space that had been designed for exactly this kind of controlled grandeur. Round tables, low lighting, waitstaff moving with the trained invisibility of people paid to be furniture. She picked out Damien immediately, east side, talking to a man she didn't recognize. She picked out Lucienne at the center table, white-haired and smiling, working the room with the comfortable authority of a man who believed he had already won. She couldn't see Celine yet. She opened the door fully and stepped through, and her father followed. They moved along the room's perimeter, staying close to the wall, using the waitstaff and the movement of guests as cover. Maris kept her face angled slightly down. Not suspicious, just the angle of someone watching their footing in heeled shoes, which was actually accurate and useful. She made it to a position near the bar, sheltered by a structural column, and sent the text, "We're in." 20 seconds later, Damien separated from his conversation and moved toward the east windows. Naturally, the way you'd move to look at the view, and she watched Lucienne's eyes track him across the room. Lucienne was watching Damien. Good. That meant he wasn't watching her. She checked her watch. 8:14. Reyes needed the network access window. Damien needed to reach the system terminal in the event space's tech booth, an installation point Reyes had identified that would give them a hardwired connection point inside the building rather than relying on wireless at this height. The tech booth was at the far end of the room, behind a discrete partition. She needed to get Damien there. He needed 6 minutes inside it. Lucienne needed to be occupied for those 6 minutes. She looked at the room, at her father beside her, who was watching Lucienne with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man facing the living manifestation of 18 months of terror. She put her hand briefly on his arm. Not yet, she said very quietly. I know, he said. She looked for Celine, found her finally, near the central tables. Green dress, dark hair, the practiced social ease of someone who had spent 3 years learning to belong in rooms she was working to destroy. Their eyes met across the distance, and Celine's expression didn't change at all, not in any way a person watching would have noticed. But Maris saw the micro-adjustment, a slight straightening, a breath. She looked toward Lucienne. Then she walked toward him. She hadn't planned this precisely. Plans at this resolution were fictions anyway. She had a destination, Lucian, occupied for 6 minutes, and she had one tool she was certain of, which was that he had already categorized her as a manageable element, a variable, as Damien had said, an outsider who'd married into the situation and would be easier to manage than to confront directly. She walked up to Lucien Vescari and smiled the way she'd smiled at difficult clients for 6 years, and said, "Mr. Vescari, I was hoping I'd get a chance to speak with you tonight." He turned, and the charm landed on his face so fast it was almost impressive. "My dear." He took her hand with both of his. The same gesture as the Thursday dinner, the warmth deployed like a weapon. "I didn't expect to see you here." Damien thought it was time I attended. She held his gaze without flinching. "I've been wanting to understand his world better." "Have you?" His pale eyes moved over her face, assessing, recalculating. She watched him decide she was either brave or naive and file her under the second category, which was exactly what she wanted. "I understand you and Damien have some tension," she said. "Family things are complicated." Lucian smiled. "Damien and I understand each other very well." "I think you might be overestimating that," she said pleasantly, and watched the flicker behind his eyes. Not offense, but sharpened attention. He leaned in slightly. "You're more interesting than I expected, Mrs. Vescari." "Most people say that," she said. She kept him there for 4 minutes through what she would later only remember as a controlled performance of apparent naivety that required more sustained focus than anything she'd ever done, asking questions that sounded like the questions of a woman still learning her position, questions that required elaboration to answer properly, questions that gave Lucian the pleasure of his own expertise while she tracked in her peripheral vision. Damien's movement toward the tech booth, the slight shift in Celine's position toward the room's central data terminal, the way the room's rhythm was changing in some barely perceptible way. At 8:22, she felt her phone vibrate. One buzz. "Reyes. Ready." She looked at Lucien, and then a voice from the center of the room carrying clearly across the general murmur, "Ladies and gentlemen." The gathering's host, a man she didn't know, with a microphone and the oblivious timing of ceremony. "If we could take our seats for the first address of the evening." The room began moving. Lucien's attention shifted to the seating arrangement. She stepped back and sent the reply to Reyes. "Go." And then she turned and found her way to Damien at the edge of the tech booth partition. And when she reached him, she could see he was already moving back into the room. The booth door pulled closed behind him, and his expression said it was done. 6 seconds later, Celine Duval crossed the room to Lucien's side. She put her hand on his arm, and when he turned toward her, she said something Maris couldn't hear across the room, and Lucien's face changed. Not the social face, not the charm, something underneath it, rising fast. He said something back. Celine said something else. Her chin was up, and her voice now was carrying, and what she said reached the tables nearest to her in fragments. "Federal records," and "Your brother's order." And the name that arrived next in Celine's voice was Antonio Vescari, and the room's ambient noise dropped by half in 2 seconds, because everyone in this room understood whose name that was. Damien had gone still beside Maris. His hand found her arm without looking. Celine wasn't whispering anymore. Celine was talking to the room. Her voice was controlled and clear, and she spoke with the specific steadiness of someone who had been waiting 3 years to say something in front of witnesses. And what she said included her federal handler's name and the syndicate's account structure and the names of 3 people at tables within 20 feet of her who she identified by their role in the network, and the room went from dropped noise to actual silence in the span of 10 seconds. Lucien's face had gone through several expressions and arrived at one that was cold and still and very, very dangerous. He reached into his jacket. The security man nearest him moved, then a second security man from the opposite direction, one of Damien's, one Maris hadn't known was there. And the 3-way collision of motion in the center of the room was the spark that ignited everything. What followed happened in multiple directions at once, tables moving, guests on their feet, a crack of sound from somewhere she couldn't place that hit a glass panel and sent it into 1,000 fragments. Damien was moving, not away, toward, and she grabbed her father's arm and pulled him toward the wall and got low and looked for Lucien. He was gone from the center of the room. She scanned and found him at the room's north end, moving fast, two men with him clearing his path. In his hand, not a gun, not yet, a phone. He was making a call. She understood what the call was, backup or abort, or the one instruction that could make the entire night worse. She looked at Damien, who was 10 feet away dealing with someone she didn't recognize, and she made a decision that her brain processed as a sequence of pure if-then logic. If Lucien reaches the exit and makes that call, the network gets warning and the transmission Reyes sent out becomes suppressible. If Lucien doesn't reach the exit, if someone interrupts the call, the transmission propagates without a counter-response. She went after him. She lost her shoes in the first 10 feet because heels and chaos were incompatible, and she had grown up running barefoot through irrigation ditches. And she crossed the room's north end in 8 seconds, and came through the door Lucien had gone through into the private corridor behind the event space, and saw him 40 feet ahead with his phone to his ear and his 2 security men flanking. She shouted his name. He turned. She walked toward him with nothing in her hands, and nothing that looked like anything except a woman who had made a decision she intended to finish, and she said, "The transmission already went. 47 law enforcement databases. International. You can make that call, but all you'll do is tell the people on the other end that it's over." Lucien lowered the phone by 3 inches. His eyes on her were completely flat. "You have no idea," he said, very quietly, "what you've walked into." "I have a precise idea," she said. "I've had one for about 36 hours. One of his security men shifted. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Lucien, because breaking the eye contact would be the one thing she absolutely could not do. And she felt her pulse in her temples and the cold of the corridor floor on her bare feet and the specific terror of having done something irreversible and having to stand in front of it now. Lucien's expression changed. The flat, dangerous blankness resolved into something else. Not the charm, not the calculation, but something older and colder underneath both of them. "Get her," he said. The security man moved, and she was already moving too, back toward the door. But the corridor was long, and she was without shoes, and the door was 40 feet away, and she understood in the half-second before the man's hand caught her arm that she had gotten Lucien to stop making the call, but she had not gotten herself a clear exit, and that was the miscalculation, the thing she'd traded away to buy the transmission time, and now she was in a corridor with Lucien Vescari's hands deciding what happened next. The door at the other end of the corridor, the far end, not the one she'd come through, burst open. Damien came through it. He took in the corridor in a single sweep, and his eyes found her, and then they found the security man's grip on her arm, and what crossed his face in that moment was something she had never seen there and would not be able to fully describe afterward. Not rage exactly, but something that included rage and was larger than it, something that had been building for 12 years and had just found its point of release. He moved. The security man who'd been holding her arm didn't hold it for the next 4 seconds. The second security man met Damien and didn't win the exchange. She pressed herself against the wall and watched Damien move through them with the efficiency of someone who had not arrived at this moment in crisis but in purpose. And in 8 seconds, both of Lucien's men were on the floor, and Damien was standing between her and Lucien, with blood from the cut on his cheekbone running freely, and his breathing controlled and his eyes on his uncle. Lucien had taken 3 steps back. He still had his phone. He was looking at Damien with an expression that was, for the first time she'd seen, not composed. "This doesn't end here," Lucien said. "It ends somewhere," Damien said. "And you've been deciding where for 12 years. Lucien turned and ran. Damien went after him without a pause, and Maris went after Damien because standing in a corridor in a crisis was survivable, but standing in it alone was not. And behind them she could hear the chaos of the event space bleeding into the corridor, voices and footsteps, and the distant wail of building alarms triggered by something she hoped was Reyes's transmission completing, and not something worse. The corridor went left and then terminated at a stairwell door that was swinging shut, and they went up, which was wrong. Up was toward the roof, up was a dead end. And she understood that Lucien either knew something about the roof, she didn't, or he had stopped calculating exits and was running on pure survival instinct, which was the most dangerous version of a dangerous man. The roof door hit her with cold air, and the city at 44 stories, The full sprawl of it, the wind cutting through the dress she was wearing, and rain. She hadn't known it was raining, but it was raining, the fine, insistent kind that made everything slick and cold and complicated. Lucien was 20 feet ahead, moving toward the north edge of the roof, and she saw why. A helicopter on the rooftop pad, rotors already moving, which meant he'd had this staged, had known or planned for the possibility that the gathering would end in evacuation, had prepared an exit no one had accounted for. Damien was between her and Lucien, still moving, gaining ground on the wet rooftop, and Lucien reached the helicopter's door and turned, and Maris saw what was in his hand now. Not the phone anymore. And she shouted Damien's name without thinking, and he dropped left and the shot went wide, and she heard it hit something metal behind her and felt the air move. Damien was back up in 2 seconds. Lucien was inside the helicopter. The door wasn't closed yet. Damien reached it before it closed. And what followed on the rooftop of the Cavendish Tower in the rain, at 44 stories with the city burning bright below, was the most brutal thing she had ever witnessed. Not cinematic, not clean, nothing like anything that word combat suggested from a distance, but up close and physical and desperate. 2 men who had 12 years of history between them and only one possible endpoint. She stood at the edge of the helicopter pad with the rain on her face and her heart doing something structural, and she watched, because looking away was not an option, and because Damien had not looked away from anything in this entire catastrophe, and she owed him at least that much. The helicopter shifted on the pad. One of the rotors changed pitch. She felt it in her sternum. Damien had Lucien at the helicopter door, and Lucien had his hand on the frame, and the pilot was clearly trying to decide whether to lift anyway. And Damien said something she couldn't hear over the rotor wash and the rain, something close and direct, and intended only for the man in front of him. And whatever it was, Lucien's face did something complicated and open that she'd never seen on it before. Then Lucien reached for Damien's jacket, and Damien's grip on the doorframe was the only thing between them and 44 stories of open air, and she moved without deciding to, crossing the rooftop at a run toward the helicopter, toward the man who had just said he would die for her before she believed he was worth trusting, toward whatever came next. She reached the helicopter in 6 steps and grabbed the doorframe beside Damien with both hands and felt the rotor wash hit her like a physical wall, the rain horizontal at this height, the city below them a blurred grid of light through the wet. Lucien's grip on Damien's jacket was the kind of grip that wasn't holding on. It was pulling, deliberate, the last calculation of a man who had decided that if he went over the edge, he was not going alone. She saw it in the angle of Lucien's arm, in the set of his shoulders, in the way his feet had found the helicopter's door sill and were using it as leverage. Damien saw it too. She could tell by the way his body adjusted, not pulling back, which would have given Lucien the mechanical advantage, but shifting his weight laterally, breaking the pull's geometry, and with his free hand he grabbed the back of Lucien's collar and turned the motion around. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Lucien lost his grip on the door sill. His feet came free. The helicopter lurched, the pilot finally making the decision to lift. Too late, the landing gear leaving the pad by 18 inches. And the shift in the frame knocked Lucien's balance entirely, and he went down onto the wet rooftop, not over the edge, but onto the pad itself, hard, and his gun skittered across the concrete and off into the dark below the pad's railing. The helicopter rose. The rotor wash intensified for 4 seconds, and then it was climbing, banking north, carrying a pilot who had made the survival decision to leave without his employer, and then it was just the rain and the wind and the roof and Lucien on his hands and knees on the wet concrete, and Damien standing over him, breathing hard. Maris stood 3 feet behind Damien with her hands shaking, not from cold, not entirely, and watched Lucien push himself to one knee and then stop. He looked up at Damien. His white hair was plastered flat by the rain, and his elegant suit was ruined, and the charm, the avuncular warmth, the political smile, all of it was gone. What was left was a man in his 60s on a rooftop in the rain who had just run out of moves. He looked at Damien for a long moment. "Antonio wouldn't have built what you've built," he said. His voice was conversational, almost like they'd arrived at the end of a different argument. He was too soft, too principled. He would have given everything away. Damien said nothing. "I did what was necessary," Lucien said. "Everything I've done, everything." Damien crouched down in front of him, which was not what she expected. She'd expected distance, the distance of someone who had been wronged beyond reconciliation. But he crouched down and looked at his uncle at eye level in the rain and said very quietly, "I know you believe that." Lucian held his gaze. Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Not remorse, not quite, but something in the same country. The look of a man confronting the distance between what he'd told himself and what it actually was. The roof door opened. 3 federal agents came through it in body armor, followed by 2 more, and behind them a man in a dark suit she didn't recognize who moved with the authority of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment for a professionally satisfying amount of time. He looked at Lucian on the wet concrete and looked at Damien standing and looked at Maris barefoot in a soaked black dress, and he said, with complete administrative calm, "We'll take it from here." The next 4 hours happened in pieces she would later only be able to reconstruct in partial order. Federal agents filling the Cavendish Tower. The event space on 44 becoming a processing site for 60-something guests, most of whom were guilty of something and some of whom were guilty of everything. Her father, located in the corridor below the roof by Ortega and brought up safely, standing at the edge of the roof's access area with his arms wrapped around himself and an expression she had no language for yet. Reyes, 2 miles away in his surveillance vehicle, watching confirmation codes roll in from 47 law enforcement databases on 3 continents and sending her a single text that read, "It's everywhere. They can't stop it now." A paramedic who found her at some point and cleaned the cut on her foot she hadn't noticed she'd gotten, probably from the glass on the 44th floor, and wrapped it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had worked crowd events gone wrong before and categorized this as a variant of that. Damien, sitting on the low railing at the roof's edge, too close to the edge, she thought, and then understood he was doing it deliberately, the way you stand at a cliff to confirm you're not afraid of it, watching the city below with the particular stillness of a man processing something too large to process standing up. She went and sat beside him. They didn't speak for a while. The rain had thinned to mist. The city below them was fully lit, indifferent, enormous. "Your cheek," she said. He touched it. His fingers came away with dried blood, reddened by rain. "It's fine. It needs to be cleaned." Later, she looked at the city. "He's in custody." "Yes." "The pilot?" "They'll track the helicopter. He won't get far." A pause. "He was contracted. He doesn't matter." She breathed. The mist was fine enough that she could feel it on her face as almost nothing. The boundary between air and water dissolved. The agent in the dark suit, he knew exactly where to come and when. "Celine's handler," Damien said. "She's been feeding him operational updates for 3 years. Tonight she told him we'd need the roof in approximately 40 minutes. He paused. "She was 7 minutes off." "Where is she?" "Already in a secure vehicle. Witness protection processing starts tonight." He was quiet for a moment. "She'll get a new name. New city. She's been ready for it for a year. She told me when I reached her. She said she'd been ready to be done for a year. She just needed a clean exit." She thought about Celine Duval standing in Lucian's orbit for 3 years with that bone-deep exhaustion on her face, carrying the weight of a long game in a room full of people who would have killed her if they'd known what she was. Maris felt something complicated and genuine about her that wasn't friendship exactly, but was close to the thing that comes before friendship when you've recognized someone across a distance. "She'll be okay?" she said. "I'll make sure she has everything she needs." He said it simply, without the qualifier of what their history had been. She took it at face value. She looked down at the city. 44 stories below, ordinary people were moving through ordinary nights. Getting home from late shifts, walking dogs, sitting in lit apartment windows doing the invisible daily work of lives that had nothing to do with rooftop confrontations and encrypted microfilm and the particular cost of refusing powerful men. "What happens to your business?" she said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "The legitimate operations stay. The construction portfolio, the security consulting, the logistics network, those are clean, have been clean for 4 years. The other parts..." He stopped. "I've been moving toward a line for a while. Tonight might be what finally crosses it." "What does that mean practically?" "It means I spend the next several years in a different kind of uncomfortable conversation. with federal prosecutors mostly. He looked at her sideways. The agent in the dark suit asked me, on the roof, whether I was prepared to cooperate fully. What did you tell him? I told him to talk to my attorney. A pause. But yes, I'm prepared. She held that for a moment. It wasn't the answer of a man making a grand gesture. It was the answer of a man who had thought about this before tonight, maybe for a long time, and had arrived at the same conclusion through the slow accumulation of his own evidence. Your parents would... She stopped. Don't, he said, but without sharpness. I don't need that. I know. She didn't finish the sentence. He was right. He didn't need that. He'd spent 12 years doing what he'd done without it, and it was already built into what he'd built, and she didn't need to say it for it to be true. They sat on the railing until the agent in the dark suit came back to the roof and told them it was time to come inside. The formal interviews lasted 2 days. She gave her statement 3 times to 3 different parties: federal investigators, a Department of Justice attorney, and a representative of an international financial crimes unit she hadn't known existed before this week. She gave it the same way each time, with the same careful factual precision, without editorializing, without framing. She had mapped the financial records in her head for 36 hours, and she walked them through it from memory and watched the investigators' reactions tell her she'd understood it correctly. Her father's interview lasted 6 hours on the first day and another 4 on the second. She wasn't in the room for any of it. She sat in a hallway on a government building's 4th floor with a paper cup of coffee and Tuck, who Ortega had retrieved from the compound in the early morning hours and brought to wherever she was because Damien had apparently, at some point in the last 48 hours, given that specific instruction. She buried her fingers in Tuck's fur and let him be the thing she held onto, and she did not think too hard about what was happening in the interview rooms or how much her father's cooperation would cost him, because those were questions that would have answers in time, and she had learned, brutally and specifically in the last 4 weeks, that running toward answers before they were ready only produced more damage. On the second afternoon, her father came out and sat down beside her in the hallway. He looked reduced in a specific way, not broken, but compressed, like something had been pressed out of him that had been taking up space he didn't need. He looked at Tuck and reached over and scratched the dog's ear without saying anything for a moment. Then, they're recommending a formal immunity agreement in exchange for full testimony. The attorney thinks I'll receive it. She absorbed this. And then? And then I'm responsible for what I owe. The investments, the vineyard. He looked at his hands. I'll need to start over, properly this time. You're 61, she said. I know. She looked down the hallway at nothing in particular. The vineyard debt is discharged. That was in the contract. She paused. The contract that you designed. He looked at her. I know, he said again, and this time it was smaller. The sound of a man not running from the weight of it. She had spent 4 days moving too fast to sit with what her father had done. The engineering of her situation, the removal of her choice, the elaborate structure of protection that had also been an elaborate structure of control. She sat with it now, in the hallway, with the dog between them and the fluorescent light overhead, and no immediate emergency pressing her forward. You were afraid, she said. Terrified, he said. I was terrified for months before I disappeared. The things I found in those records, Maris, the people named, the reach of it. He stopped. I didn't trust the official channels. I didn't trust that I could protect you through normal means, and I made a decision that wasn't mine to make. No, she said, it wasn't. I know. She looked at him. He looked back, and in his face was the full accounting of it, not just the apology, which was easy, but the harder thing, which was knowing exactly what he'd done and being unable to undo it and having to live with what that cost her. I'm not ready to tell you it's all right, she said. I'm not asking you to be. Good. She picked up her coffee. Because it's going to take a while. He nodded. She saw the grief of that land on him cleanly and watched him accept it without asking her to carry it for him, which was perhaps the first time in her adult life she'd seen him do that. And she held the grief of that version of him she hadn't gotten sooner, and she let it be. She would work her way back. She knew her own durability well enough to know that. It just wouldn't be today. Damien's formal interviews extended through most of the first week. She saw him briefly each evening, in the government housing they'd both been assigned for the duration of the process. Adjacent rooms in a secure facility that felt like a hotel designed by someone who'd only read about comfort rather than experienced it. He looked progressively less like a man who'd slept, which she found irritating in the specific way of someone tracking another person's self-neglect and feeling more invested in it than was strategically wise. On the fourth evening, she knocked on his door with 2 cups of coffee from the facility's kitchen, and he opened it and looked at the cups and at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Let me in." He stepped back. His room was the same as hers, but with files spread across the small desk and 2 phones charging simultaneously, and a jacket folded over the chair in the way of someone who had taken it off and put it down and forgotten about it immediately. She set the coffees on the desk and moved the jacket to the bed and sat in the chair, and he sat on the edge of the bed. "The immunity agreement for your father goes through tomorrow," he said. "The federal attorney confirmed this afternoon." "I know, he told me." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "What about your agreement?" "Full cooperation in exchange for a reduced role in the prosecution. My operations documentation for the last 6 years goes into evidence." He looked at the floor. "Some of it is. The things we did that weren't what happened on Hayward Street. There were things that weren't Hayward Street." She heard the weight of that. She didn't ask him to elaborate because she understood that he was telling her it existed, not asking her to absolve it. The distinction mattered to her. "The corporations are being restructured," he continued. "The legitimate portfolio remains in my control, subject to federal oversight, for 4 years. The rest is dissolved or transferred." He paused. "The security and humanitarian operation I've been building, the one that contracts with NGOs for protective operations in high-risk areas, that continues. It's what I want it to be." "That's the one you've been funding through shell companies," she said. "For 3 years. The shell structure goes away. It runs under its own name now." He looked up at her. "It turns out some things work better in daylight." She looked at him. He was exhausted and bruised and in a government facility wearing a shirt that needed ironing, and he was talking about humanitarian operations in high-risk areas with the same measured focus he'd applied to everything else. And she had the specific, inconvenient feeling of a woman who has been trying to maintain calibrated distance from a person and finding the calibration increasingly difficult. "The contract," she said. He looked at her steadily. "What about it?" "It runs for 12 months. We're at, 5 weeks?" "6, he said. "As of yesterday." She held his gaze. "I've been thinking about the addendum I asked for. The one protecting my father from punitive action without my consent. I remember it. It was the first thing I asked for that wasn't just survival," she said. "It was the first thing I asked for that was actually—" She stopped. "I think it was the first moment I treated the situation as real rather than as a cage to get out of." He was very still. "I'm not telling you I was wrong to treat it as a cage," she said. "I was in a cage. The fact that the cage was built out of protection instead of malice doesn't change the shape of it." She looked at her coffee. "But I'm telling you that something changed after the archive room, after the night Marco ran, after Zurich." She looked back up. "I stopped trying to find the exit and started trying to understand what I was actually in the middle of." Damien set down his cup very carefully on the floor beside the bed and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the gray eyes she'd spent 6 weeks learning and still hadn't finished. "What are you saying?" he said, and his voice was the quietest she'd heard it, and underneath the quiet was something she'd only caught in fragments before. The unguarded version, the one he kept below the controlled surface. "I don't know exactly," she said. "I know the contract has 11 months left. I know I didn't choose to enter it. I know that everything I built in that house, the map of the place, the understanding of you, whatever this is, I built it under conditions that weren't freely chosen." She held his gaze. "I also know that what I built is real, and I don't want to make a decision about it while we're sitting in a government facility 6 days after a rooftop fight in the rain." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's reasonable," he said. "I know it is." She stood up. Drink your coffee, sleep more than 4 hours. She picked up her own cup and moved to the door. Maris. She stopped, didn't turn immediately. Let the moment exist without filling it. I had fallen in love with you, he said, before I understood it was happening, before the archive room, before Zurich, before any of the parts that were significant. A pause. I want you to know that, not as a claim on anything, just as a fact that's yours to do what you want with. She stood at the door for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him, sitting on the edge of the bed in a government room, honest in the most stripped-back way she'd ever seen from him, offering something with both hands and no expectation. And she thought about 6 weeks and a broken chain and a contract she'd signed at a kitchen table with dried ink and her grandfather's vines and her dead mother's necklace and a dog who'd adapted to new territory with more grace than she had. I know, she said. She went back to her room and sat with Tuck on the floor for a long time. 3 months later, on a Tuesday in late winter, the syndicate's primary prosecution opened in federal court. Lucien Vescari was one of 23 defendants across 4 countries. The charges included racketeering, conspiracy, financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and, after Celine's testimony was added to the federal record, conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of Antonio and Clara Vescari 12 years prior. Damien did not attend the first day of proceedings. He was in a meeting with the board of the newly restructured Vescari Global Security and Humanitarian Group, reviewing operational deployment for a protective mission in a part of the world she'd never been to, with a team that was smaller than what he'd had 6 months ago, but was, for the first time, entirely clean. She knew this because he told her about it that evening, on the phone, because she was at the vineyard. She'd come back 3 weeks after the government facility released them, because the vineyard existed and needed tending, and because she'd found, after 6 weeks away, that 40 acres of old vines were one of the most reliable things she knew. She'd hired 2 part-time workers with the first month of the contract's stipend. The contract was still technically operative, and Damien had not raised the subject of voiding it early, and neither had she. And she'd started the process of repairing what 2 years of financial crisis had damaged. The irrigation controller had been replaced. The east section's drainage had been repaired. The vines were dormant for winter, but they were there. The 40-year-old ones and the younger ones both, rooted in the same ground her grandfather had first pressed seeds into with his own hands. She called Damien on Tuesday evenings. He called her on Thursday mornings. This had developed without either of them formally deciding it, the way things develop when 2 people stop performing and start simply existing in intermittent proximity. He came to the vineyard on the last weekend of February. She met him at the gate in jeans and mud on her boots and tuck at her heel, and he was in clothes she'd never seen on him. Dark trousers, a gray sweater, no suit. And he looked different in them. Younger, somehow, or less armored, or both. You look like a person, she said. I've been working on it, he said. She let him in. She showed him the east section's new drainage work, which was not a romantic gesture but was the thing she was proudest of in the last 3 months. And he walked the rows with her in the late February cold and looked at the dormant vines with genuine attention rather than polite tolerance, which she appreciated. She showed him where the 40-year-old stock was and explained what would come from it in April if the winter held, and he listened with the focused presence he applied to everything. At the far end of the east section, where the ground rose slightly and the view opened up across the valley, they stopped. She pulled something from her jacket pocket, a folded document. She'd been carrying it for a week, deciding when. She held it out to him. He took it, unfolded it, read it. It was the contract, the full 17 pages, with the addendum she'd requested and the clause he'd approved and all the terms they'd lived inside for the past several months. He looked at her. She'd brought a lighter. She held it out. He looked at the contract, and then at the lighter, and then at her face, and something moved through his expression that she'd learned to read as the moment when Damien Vescari stopped calculating and simply felt something, and she held his gaze while he felt it. He took the lighter. They burned the contract at the edge of the east section on a cold February afternoon, the paper catching fast in the dry winter air, the ash lifting off into the valley in small, dark pieces that dissolved before they hit the ground. She watched it burn down to the last corner and then to nothing, and when it was gone, she put the lighter back in her pocket and looked at the view. I want to say something, Damien said. Then say it. He looked at the valley. I spent 12 years building things inside conditions I didn't choose. I started because I had to, and I kept going because stopping felt like losing, and somewhere in the middle of it, I stopped being sure why. He paused. I know why now. I needed to see what it looked like when it was right, when the thing being built was actually what it was supposed to be. He turned to her. I needed to see someone do that so I could understand what I was doing wrong. She looked at him. You're not going to be easy, she said. No. You've spent 12 years making autonomous decisions under extreme conditions. You have significant trust deficits. You communicate by omission as a first instinct. I know. I'm not easy either, she said. I hold things. I don't ask for help until I've already carried something past the point I should have. I'm stubborn about my own judgment in ways that have gotten me into trouble. I've noticed, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the smallest way. She looked at him for a long moment. At the face she'd spent 6 weeks learning under pressure and 3 months learning from a distance, and that she now understood was something she wanted to keep learning, slowly, in daylight, on her own terms. The vineyard needs someone who can manage the irrigation accounting, she said. It's not a full-time position, more of an ongoing advisory role. He held her gaze. I have a restructured international corporation. I know. You can do both. She turned and started back toward the house. Dinner in an hour. I hope you eat soup. He stood at the end of the east section for a moment. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path behind her shirts, not rushed, but deliberate, closing the distance. Tuck moved between them as they walked back, which he did with everyone he'd decided was permanent, which was his way of saying what dogs said through proximity. You belong here now, both of you, in this specific configuration, on this ground. In late April, when the vines had broken dormancy and the east section was full of the tender violet green of early leaf growth, Maris was in the irrigation rows at 7 in the morning when her phone rang. Her father. I'm at the gate, he said. I brought coffee and an apology, and I found something in the house when I was cleaning out my office. Your mother's things. There's a box I think you should have. She stood in the April morning in the green rose with the phone warm against her ear and the smell of wet earth rising around her feet. The gate code is 6241, she said. Come in. She looked back at the house. Through the kitchen window, she could see Damien at the counter, which was a new and still slightly strange and not at all unwelcome thing to see, and he was looking at something on his laptop with one hand around a coffee cup and Tuck at his feet. She looked at the vines, the 40-year-old ones. Her grandfather's hands in the earth and her mother's pearl earrings and a silver chain without a locket and a document that was ash in the valley now, gone clean. She put her phone in her pocket and began walking back toward the house. The morning was cold and clear and very bright, the way valley mornings are in spring when everything that survived the winter has decided to say so as loudly as possible. And she walked toward the kitchen window and the man inside it and the sound of a car on the gravel drive behind her. And she did not slow down and she did not look back, not because the past wasn't real, but because she'd already learned what it had to teach her, every brutal and expensive lesson of it, and what was in front of her was still unwritten and entirely hers. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.